In the quiet glow of an Istanbul evening, the empire seemed as permanent as the horizon itself. The call to prayer drifted over rooftops, folding into the low hum of markets settling for the night. Lamps flickered along the Bosporus, their reflections trembling like thin gold threads on the water. To anyone standing on one of those shorelines, the world looked complete, unshakable, shielded by centuries of victories and belief. The Ottomans had built a realm that felt carved out of time, and the people who lived under its vast shadow treated its endurance as a simple fact of life. Inside the palace libraries, scholars traced ancient manuscripts with steady hands, unaware of how their own world would one day become an artifact. In the narrow streets, merchants spoke of profits and shipments, trusting that tomorrow's routines would match today's. Even the soldiers drilling in torchlight along the courtyards, disciplined, confident, anchored in tradition, moved as though nothing could disrupt the rhythm that had guided generations before them. Everything suggested continuity. Everything whispered permanence. Yet beneath this calm surface, tiny shifts had already begun. They were not loud enough to disturb the peace of the capital or stir fear in the hearts of its people. They appeared instead as quiet patterns, so subtle that few ever recognized them as warnings. A late payment here, an overlooked appointment there, a decision made for convenience rather than strength. Each choice seemed harmless, almost invisible. But like small cracks forming deep inside stone, they widened slowly, silently, without anyone leaning close enough to listen. Empires rarely fall in the dramatic ways stories like to imagine. They do not crumble the moment an enemy appears on the horizon or when a battle goes wrong. More often, they begin to fade long before they realize something is slipping out of place. Power erodes not through sudden force, but through the gentle weight of habits. The Ottomans believed the cycle of their past victories guaranteed their future. Confidence had hardened into assumption, and assumption had settled into blindness. The empire still moved with grace, yet a strange stillness lived inside its beauty. Decisions that once demanded thought now passed without question. Systems built for flexibility stiffened into rituals. Voices that should have carried warnings softened into polite murmurs. No tragedies unfolded on the surface. No storms shook the city. But the first threads of decline had already begun, weaving themselves quietly through the tapestry of daily life. There were moments when someone might notice something slightly off, a delayed message from a distant province, a commander dissatisfied with new recruits, a merchant whispering about the shifting currents of trade. These were hints, faint and fragile, like shadows passing across an evening wall. They did not frighten anyone, they did not force change. They simply appeared and faded, as if waiting for an empire too certain of itself to pay attention. Still, in the calm of that Istanbul dusk, the illusion of eternal strength held firm. People believed the empire's heart beat with the same steady rhythm it always had. They trusted walls that had protected generations. They walked streets that seemed immune to time. No one imagined the possibility that centuries of dominance could begin unraveling quietly, in moments too gentle to disturb sleep. Yet this is how decline begins. Not with collapse, but with silence. The first signs hide beneath comfort, beneath tradition, beneath the confidence that tomorrow will always resemble today. And as the city settled into night, the empire drifted a little further from the awareness it desperately needed. The smallest shifts were already gathering, preparing to shape choices that would echo for centuries. And from this stillness, we moved toward the first quiet decisions that would alter the empire's path in ways no one yet understood. Empires rarely crumble from a single catastrophic choice. Their fate is shaped instead by the quiet decisions made in ordinary rooms, by officials who believe they are simply following routine. In the Ottoman world, these choices often felt harmless. A slight tax revision meant to ease a provincial burden, a modest appointment granted to please a loyal family, a small exemption offered to a favoured regiment. None of these actions seemed capable of bending the arc of history. Yet each carried a subtle weight, shifting the empire's direction by degrees too small for anyone to notice. Like a great ship drifting across calm waters, a single adjustment to the rudder mattered little in the moment, but over long distances it determined the destination. In the golden halls of the palace, these decisions formed the background hum of daily governance. Scribes inked decrees that would ripple through distant territories. Advisors recommended candidates for seemingly minor positions, their voices wrapped in the language of loyalty. Officials adjusted rules so that certain posts required less oversight or fewer examinations. Everything moved gently, tidily, predictably. But behind this serene surface, merit began to loosen its grip. Where once the empire prized competence and discipline, it slowly allowed personal connections to tug at the seams. The shift was not dramatic. It was almost invisible, like the soft settling of dust in a room no one thinks to clean. These early alterations created a quiet imbalance. When a talented administrator was overlooked in favor of someone politically convenient, the difference felt small. When an inexperienced commander received a promotion because of family prestige, few considered the long-term cost. When soldiers lobbied for privileges that bent old regulations, their requests seemed too minor to resist. Every empire reaches a moment when tradition becomes comfortable enough to protect even its weakest parts. For the Ottomans, this moment arrived without warning, concealed in the very confidence that once made them strong. The court, too, began to drift inward. Advisors who had once brought news from distant provinces softened their reports to avoid displeasing superiors. Courtiers learned that the safest message to deliver was the one that made the room feel calm. Over time, uncomfortable truths faded from the palace, replaced by polished assurances. The central government became an echo chamber, repeating its own beliefs back to itself until those beliefs felt like reality. It is easy to imagine that the empire's greatest dangers came from rival powers, yet the most damaging threat was internal, the slow dimming of honest counsel. Meanwhile, in regions far from the capital, the effects of these decisions accumulated like sediment. A governor, appointed through connections rather than skill, mishandled local disputes. A tax collector, given too much freedom, pushed communities harder than necessary. A military detachment, receiving relaxed oversight, drifted into complacency. None of these developments sparked immediate crisis. They happened quietly, folded into the rhythm of daily life. But collectively, they formed the early architecture of decline. The empire's vast size once allowed it to absorb errors. Now those errors spread faster than the system could correct them. As the years passed, the distance between intention and consequence widened. Decisions meant to simplify governance made oversight weaker. Choices designed to avoid conflict created deeper fractures. Efforts to preserve harmony produced pockets of resentment. And yet, from within, everything still looked stable. The palace remained illuminated. The armies marched in ceremonial displays. The markets bustled. The empire's silhouette against the world appeared unchanged. Only by stepping back far enough to see the broad sweep of time would anyone realize that these tiny choices had begun to bend the empire's trajectory toward a future no one anticipated. This is the quiet truth of decline. It begins not with a roar, but with a whisper. It lives inside the subtle comforts that leaders mistake for wisdom, inside the traditions they refuse to question, inside the decisions they make simply because they seem easier than alternatives. The Ottomans believed their foundations were firm. They trusted the habits that had guided generations. And so the early signs went unnoticed, carried along by the gentle tide of routine. Now, with the curtain pulled slightly back, we move toward the moment when one subtle decision would shift from harmless to historic, an inflection point that revealed just how fragile even the strongest empire could become. There are moments in history that look insignificant when they occur, moments so small and quiet that no one present realizes they have just stepped across an invisible threshold. In the Ottoman Empire, one such moment unfolded not on a battlefield or in a council of war, but inside a modest chamber in the palace, where scribes bent over parchment and officials debated with calm voices. It was here that a single administrative decision was made, one meant to preserve order, yet destined to reshape the empire far more than the grand victories or defeats recorded in chronicles. The decree restricted the mobility of the Janissaries, binding them more tightly to the capital and altering a centuries-old tradition that had once defined their strength. For generations, the Janissaries had been the empire's sharpest edge. They were trained from childhood, molded through discipline, and kept apart from ordinary life so their loyalty would remain pure. They moved with precision and carried an aura that unsettled enemies and impressed allies. But over time, comfort had begun creeping into their ranks. Privileges collected like dust on armor. Expectations softened. The decision to restrict them might have seemed like a solution, a measure to restore discipline by preventing them from wandering through the provinces, marrying freely, or pursuing trades that distracted from military duty. On parchment, it appeared orderly, logical, even necessary. Yet this signature carried a quiet paradox. By limiting their movement, the state unintentionally pushed the Janissaries deeper into the political life of Istanbul. Instead of sharpening their martial identity, the restriction helped blur it. They spent more time in coffee houses than in training grounds, more time discussing palace events than studying battle formations. They blended into the city's rhythms, forming networks of influence that stretched into guilds, markets, and the corridors of the palace. What had once been a disciplined corps slowly shifted into a political force capable of shaping decisions far beyond military affairs. It is easy to imagine that such a change must have caused alarm, but at the time it stirred little concern. The officials who wrote the decree believed they were tightening discipline, not weakening it. They saw the Janissaries' increasing involvement in civilian life as temporary, harmless, even adaptive. But like a ship adjusting its course by a single degree, the long-term consequences would only reveal themselves with distance. That one restriction nudged the empire toward a future where its once reliable soldiers would resist reform, challenge authority, and eventually hold the state hostage whenever change threatened their comfort. Inside the palace, the atmosphere remained serene. Scribes continued copying texts. Advisors walked through echoing halls lined with tiles that shimmered blue in the lantern light. No one felt the tremor of what had just been set in motion. Decisions made in quiet rooms rarely announce their impact. Their power lies in how they settle beneath the surface, waiting patiently for time to reveal them. The decree did not weaken the empire overnight, but it began the slow unraveling of a system that had held firm for centuries. Years later, as the Janissaries gained political leverage, the empire's rulers would struggle to reform them. Attempts to modernize the army would be met with resistance, uprisings, or subtle sabotage. What had been intended as a measure of control became a barrier to change. Reformers saw an elite force that no longer fought with the focus it once had. Instead, they saw a group entangled in privilege, one that shaped elections, influenced appointments, and used its position to resist anything that threatened its authority. The empire's leaders may have wondered how things had drifted so far, yet the answer lay in that earlier decision, the one no one had recognized as a turning point. This is the nature of quiet choices. They do not feel dangerous. They feel reasonable, even protective. But when an empire begins drifting from the values that built its strength, small adjustments become anchors that hold it in place while the world moves on. The Ottomans could not see this yet. They believed the empire remained steady, safeguarded by tradition and guided by order. They did not realize that future reform would become impossible because the very group meant to defend the state would become the one most resistant to its evolution. And so the tide turned, not with violence or catastrophe, but with ink drying on parchment in a peaceful room. This subtle shift prepares us to move into a deeper examination of the structures beneath the empire's surface, the foundations already beginning to bend, long before anyone understood the weight resting on them. Across 3 continents, the Ottoman Empire stretched like a living map, its borders touching deserts, mountains, forests, and seas. From the bustling heart of Istanbul to remote frontier towns, life unfolded in countless rhythms, each carrying its own pace, customs, and demands. The empire's size had once been its proudest achievement, a testament to its ability to hold many worlds together under a single banner. But as centuries passed, that expanse created distances too vast for any ruler to truly bridge. Messages moved slowly, twisted by the travel of days, weeks, and months. Orders left the capital with clarity, only to arrive diluted, delayed, or interpreted through the priorities of those who received them. In distant provinces, governors acted with a confidence born from necessity. With long stretches of land separating them from the palace, they learned to solve problems on their own terms. Some did so with wisdom, others with ambition. Over time, these local authorities accumulated power that rivaled the influence of those in Istanbul. Their decisions shaped the daily lives of millions, often without the capital's awareness. What was meant to be a unified realm gradually became a collection of loosely connected regions, each moving to its own quiet pulse. Communication became one of the empire's most subtle burdens. A report might take weeks to reach the capital, and by the time an instruction returned, the situation had already changed. A tax dispute could escalate before guidance arrived. A tribal disagreement could grow into a local conflict while officials in Istanbul believed all remained calm. Information traveled like whispers through long corridors, losing sharpness with each passing mile. The empire did not hear its own voice clearly. It was as if the center spoke one language and the edges another, both trusting the illusion that they still understood one another. Tax systems reflected this drift. In some regions, levies were collected strictly. In others, leniency or corruption shaped the process. Governors adjusted rates based on local alliances. Wealth that should have flowed steadily toward the capital sometimes pooled in provincial pockets or evaporated through unofficial channels. The treasury in Istanbul struggled to interpret numbers that no longer aligned, relying on records shaped more by local interests than central standards. The empire began to resemble a vast organism, slowly losing sensation in its limbs. Movements occurred, reactions followed, but the connection between them weakened. The challenge was not simply distance, it was distortion. News arriving from the provinces carried the tone of the messenger, softened to avoid blame or sharpened to gain favor. Some officials concealed unrest to protect their positions. Others exaggerated threats to justify their authority. The palace, wrapped in its own rituals and surrounded by advisors who filtered information, rarely received a clear picture. Decisions made in Istanbul floated through the empire like lanterns set adrift on a dark river, visible for a moment, then swallowed by the vastness. In this widening space between ruler and realm, subtle dysfunction took root. The empire still looked strong. Caravans crossed its lands, troops marched in formation, markets thrived. But beneath the surface, its systems were no longer synchronized. Local power rose where central oversight thinned. Loyalty shifted from the empire as a whole to the leaders who controlled each region. The unity that once defined the Ottoman world became stretched, fragile, and increasingly symbolic. And yet, few sensed danger. The empire's history was so long, its victories so many, that people believed its structure would hold, no matter how far its edges pulled away. Even in the palace, the idea of vulnerability felt distant. Life in the capital moved with serene confidence, unaware that the empire's own size had begun to swallow its voice. This expanding silence sets the stage for the next layer of decline, where distance does more than separate. It shapes the very culture of truth within the bureaucracy that claims to hold the empire together. In the soft glow of candlelit corridors, the empire's bureaucracy moved like a quiet tide, shaping decisions long before they reached the Sultan's chambers. Scribes bent over thick ledgers, their quills scratching steady lines through the night. Advisors waited with polished composure, hands folded, expressions calm, though their thoughts swirled with calculations invisible to those passing by. Ministers offered polite smiles that never reached their eyes, each one practiced enough to reveal nothing. The palace was filled with the appearance of order papers neatly stacked, seals pressed into warm wax, silence drifting through room after room. Yet beneath this stillness, a shift in the empire's inner machinery had begun. Once, the Ottoman system prided itself on merit. A talented mind could rise through the ranks, shaping policy and earning the trust of rulers. But over time, favoritism crept in like a slow fog, reshaping the way power flowed. Positions once granted through skill were now awarded through family ties, personal loyalties, or quiet negotiations behind closed doors. The bureaucratic world became a space where who one knew mattered more than what one could do. People learned that their survival depended not on competence, but on their ability to navigate the delicate webs of influence that stretched through the palace. This culture of alliances created a new form of competition. Instead of striving to serve the state, officials competed to stay in favor. A misplaced word, a misinterpreted suggestion, or a report that carried even a hint of negativity could place a career in jeopardy. And so a subtle fear began to grow, fear of speaking too plainly, fear of revealing too much, fear of saying something that might disturb the fragile comfort of those in higher positions. In this atmosphere, honesty became dangerous. Bad news, when it appeared, was carefully softened. Harsh truths were wrapped in layers of polite phrasing. Warnings were postponed, disguised, or quietly filed away. Even when messengers arrived from distant provinces with troubling reports, their words were filtered before reaching the palace. Advisors learned to deliver information that reassured rather than alarmed. A note of trouble became a minor inconvenience. A crisis became a temporary challenge. the edges of reality blurred under the weight of caution. The Sultan, surrounded by this wall of gentle voices, heard only the version of the empire that his ministers believed he wanted to hear. The bureaucracy whispered. It did not warn. Problems that needed decisive action became wrapped in the softness of diplomacy and avoidance. The empire, once able to confront challenges with clarity, now struggled to see them at all. The palace remained calm because people worked tirelessly to keep it calm, even as cracks spread quietly through the provinces. The psychological cost of this silence seeped into every level of administration. Junior officials copied the behavior of their seniors, learning to hide concerns behind pleasant expressions. Governors wrote reports that reassured the palace of their success, even when local conditions worsened. Military officers exaggerated their strength to avoid scrutiny. Everyone learned that projecting stability was safer than admitting vulnerability. And so the empire drifted deeper into a world where the truth rarely travelled unfiltered. Yet no alarms rang. The bureaucracy functioned smoothly on the surface. Meetings were held, documents were signed, decisions were made, but none of these actions reflected the empire's true condition. It was like watching a great body move while its senses dulled, unable to feel the pain spreading inside its limbs. In this environment, personal ambition quietly replaced collective duty. Officials sought connections rather than solutions. Ministries became arenas of subtle rivalry. The palace grew full of individuals who mastered the art of appearing helpful while guarding their own positions. The empire's administrative heart beat softly, rhythmically, but without the clarity that had once kept it strong. This was the danger of silence. It did not destroy the empire in a single moment. Instead, it altered the way knowledge flowed, turning truth into a rare visitor and illusion into a daily companion. The Ottomans did not lose their ability to govern overnight, they simply stopped hearing themselves clearly. And as this gentle transformation continued, the next stage of decline emerged without resistance. Favoritism became more than an unfortunate habit. It grew into a system. Corruption, once scattered and opportunistic, found room to take root. It is here, in this deepening quiet, that we move toward the next layer of the story when small distortions evolved into something far more persistent and far harder to undo. There was no single moment when corruption announced itself within the Ottoman Empire. It did not enter with a scandal or a bold betrayal. Instead, it appeared softly, woven into the daily exchanges of palace life, like a thread no one bothered to remove. A small bribe offered to expedite a document, a favour exchanged to secure a comfortable post. A nephew placed in a strategic position because his family had long served the court. These gestures felt minor, almost harmless, far too small to threaten an empire that had stood for centuries. Yet these were the first notes of a quiet language that would one day speak louder than law. Inside the palace, people learned to navigate their world not by merit or vision, but by relationships. A minister's rise depended on who supported him, rather than what he accomplished. Clerks advanced by attaching themselves to powerful patrons. Governors were appointed because they had cultivated the right alliances, not because they proved the most capable. It became normal, natural, even to rely on personal connections. Competence still existed, but it no longer carried the same weight. The empire's administrative body moved with the grace of ceremony, yet its decisions were guided by currents that had little to do with the needs of the state. These shifts were not born from malice. Most officials believed they were merely following the rhythms of survival. When everyone around them relied on favours, refusing to do the same felt foolish, even dangerous. To thrive under a system, one must learn its rules, and the rules of the late empire were written in unspoken expectations. A small gift here, a quiet promise there, a gentle reminder of loyalty, they all blended into the background, unnoticed, until they shaped the entire culture. The bureaucracy, already accustomed to whispering rather than warning, now embraced this subtle economy of influence. Decisions that should have been shaped by careful judgment instead flowed along the paths of convenience. A provincial leader who offered tribute to the right official received leniency. A tax collector who shared his profits with the correct patron kept his post. A military officer who treated his superiors generously found his shortcomings overlooked. None of these actions caused sudden disaster, but each one tugged at the threads holding the empire's integrity in place. Even the empire's most respected institutions felt the change. The Janissaries, once proud and disciplined, learned that influence granted more protection than skill. Merchants understood that success relied not solely on trade, but on maintaining the right relationships. Judges handed down rulings that balanced justice with the expectations of those who held sway over their careers. The corruption that grew in this environment was not the fiery kind that sparks outrage. It was the gentle, quiet variety that grows because no one sees a reason to stop it. And the most unsettling part was that no one ever consciously chose this path. Corruption did not arrive as a deliberate strategy. It evolved because it was easier than reform and safer than honesty. To challenge it would require confronting powerful people, altering entrenched habits, and risking personal standing. In a world where survival depended on fitting in, very few dared to push against the tide. So the empire drifted deeper into a culture where truth became negotiable and integrity became optional. For the people living within the system, the transformation was almost invisible. Life in the palace continued with the same elegant routines. Officials walked through courtyards with the same confident stride. Meetings unfolded with the same calm precision. Nothing on the surface betrayed the change taking place below. Yet those who looked closely might have sensed a subtle unease, a feeling that decisions felt hollow, that authority seemed softer, that direction had begun to slip. This creeping sense of inevitability is what makes corruption so dangerous. It doesn't tear down an empire with sudden force. It weakens the supports quietly, until the structure that once seemed unshakable begins to sag under its own weight. The Ottomans still believed in their strength, unaware that the system guiding their world was slowly losing the ability to correct itself. As this soft erosion continued, another force began stirring within the empire, one that would magnify these internal weaknesses and expose just how vulnerable the state had become. For when money falters, even the strongest illusions begin to crack. And it is here that the next chapter begins, where economic missteps give shape to the consequences of these quiet choices. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire sat at the crossroads of worlds. Caravans moved through its deserts, ships cut across its straits, and merchants passed through its markets, with the confidence that every road eventually led to Istanbul. Wealth flowed like a steady current, filling treasuries, enriching cities, and giving the empire a sense of permanence. But currents can shift quietly, and the first signs of change arrived not with alarm, but with a soft thinning of the streams that had once seemed endless. It began far away, on unfamiliar seas where European explorers traced new routes towards spices, silk, and gold. Their voyages were distant events, whispered about in coffee houses or recorded on fading parchment. Yet each successful journey carved a new path around the empire rather than through it. The great land routes that had once carried wealth into Ottoman hands grew quieter. Traders realized that sea passages were faster and, in time, cheaper. Goods that had once crossed Ottoman territory began reaching Europe without ever touching its soil. Inside the empire, the effects appeared gently at first. Caravans entered cities with fewer camels than before, their loads lighter, their journeys less frequent. Merchants who had once thrived on the movement of goods began to speak in lowered voices about fluctuating prices and uncertain markets. In the bazaars, familiar rhythms persisted, but a faint sense of unease crept into conversations. Some attributed it to temporary misfortune, others to poor harvests or distant conflicts. Few imagined that the very structure of global trade had begun shifting beneath their feet. Tax officials were among the first to sense the change. They studied the ledgers of distant provinces and noticed numbers that no longer matched expectations. Revenues from certain routes decreased without clear explanation. Duties collected on imported goods slipped by degrees too small to cause panic, yet too consistent to ignore. Reports reached the capital with cautious phrasing, softened by officials who hoped the fluctuations were temporary. But the pattern repeated itself month after month, year after year, until the decline could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Still, nothing dramatic occurred. Markets did not collapse, cities did not starve. The empire continued to function, its institutions moving with the same deliberate grace. But the flow of wealth was no longer what it had been. It slipped away like water seeping through unseen cracks, gradually reducing the empire's financial strength, even as its outward splendor remained intact. Istanbul still glittered with palaces, fountains, mosques, and tapestries, but the gold sustaining these marvels had begun to thin. The greatest challenge came from the empire's inability to perceive the danger clearly. The decline was too gentle, too slow, too easy to overlook. Empires, accustomed to abundance, often struggle to recognize the early signs of scarcity. And so the Ottomans assumed the world remained as it always had been, not realizing that Europe's new maritime power was reshaping global commerce. The empire had once controlled the arteries of trade. Now, new veins had formed that bypassed its reach entirely. This slow shift carried consequences beyond economics. With less revenue, local administrators pushed harder to meet quotas. Some increased taxes, others relied on harsher methods of collection, and many turned to unofficial means to fill the gaps. Tensions grew quietly in the provinces, hidden beneath the steady facade of imperial order. The palace, still surrounded by symbols of wealth, continued to function as though nothing essential had changed. But beneath its marble floors and gilded ceilings, the treasury no longer echoed with the weight of constant income. By the time the empire recognized the magnitude of the shift, the world had already rearranged itself. Trade had taken new shapes, fortunes had found new destinations, and the Ottoman position in global commerce had faded without a single definitive moment marking the loss. It was a decline without drama, a rebalancing that unfolded silently while the empire watched from the shore, unaware that the tide had already begun to retreat. From here, we move toward the next stage of this silent erosion. How the empire, feeling pressure but not yet understanding its cause, turned to fiscal decisions meant to restore stability, only to find that each desperate choice carried its own hidden cost. Inflation does not arrive with sound. It does not announce itself with banners or warnings. It slips in quietly, reshaping an economy grain by grain, until a nation wakes to find that the value of its money has changed beneath its feet. For the Ottoman Empire, this silent thief came from far across the Atlantic, carried not by armies or diplomats, but by ships returning to Europe with unimaginable amounts of silver from the New World. These ships altered global prices without ever touching Ottoman shores, and yet their impact reached deep into the empire's markets, treasuries, and barracks. At first, no one understood what was happening. Silver, once scarce and steady in value, began flooding European cities. Prices rose in response, and European merchants adjusted trade terms accordingly. Goods that had been affordable one year became more expensive the next. The Ottomans, who still relied on older patterns of exchange, felt this change slowly, like a fever developing in the background. A merchant in Bursa might complain that cloth cost more than it used to. A spice dealer in Aleppo might ask why last season's profits no longer stretched as far. These were murmurs, not alarms. The empire's coins, once trusted, began losing their weight, literally. As prices climbed, the state struggled to keep up. To meet expenses, officials reduced the silver content of coins, hoping no one would notice the difference. But people always notice the feel of money. They notice when a coin seems thinner, when its shine fades faster, when it feels lighter in the hand. Debasement, meant as a temporary remedy, weakened confidence one transaction at a time. Before long, a subtle question began drifting through markets and shops. What is a coin worth if every year it carries less silver? Wages lagged behind the rising prices. A craftsman found that the money he earned no longer bought the same food for his family. A widow realized her pension stretched shorter each month. The change felt like an invisible pressure tightening around everyday life. People grumbled, adjusted, and hoped the discomfort would pass. No one imagined they were experiencing the early symptoms of a long economic illness. Among the Janissaries, inflation stirred even deeper tensions. Their pay, once a reliable source of stability and pride, began losing purchasing power. Soldiers noticed that their salaries no longer met their needs. Some demanded additional payments, others insisted on bonuses to compensate for lost value. They believed the state had cheated them, not understanding that the empire itself was struggling to keep pace with global price shifts it had not caused and could not control. Small grievances simmered, and resentment quietly built within the ranks of a corps already drifting away from its disciplined origins. Inside the treasury, the atmosphere grew tense. Treasurers examined accounts late into the night, running numbers that refused to align with expectations. Even the most seasoned officials felt unease settle in as they realized revenue could no longer match expenses, yet they softened their reports, fearing the consequences of alarming their superiors. The Sultan heard that revenues fluctuated, that expenditures rose, but the full truth, how quickly the empire's finances were shifting, rarely reached him without filters. Local markets reflected the change with unmistakable signs. Prices rose unevenly, confusing buyers and sellers alike. Bread cost more in one district than in another. Cloth prices doubled within a season. Sharp disagreements erupted over wages and debts. These were not violent conflicts, but they created a subtle restlessness that spread through towns and villages. Inflation, as always, attacked trust before anything else. Still, the empire believed the problem was temporary. Officials thought prices would stabilize if they made minor adjustments. They imagined trade would return to old patterns. They hoped the world would drift back into balance. But global forces moved in only one direction, and the Ottomans had no control over the silver pouring into Europe or the rapid economic shifts it caused. What they faced was not a passing disruption, but the beginning of a structural change that would reshape their fiscal foundations. Inflation weakened the empire not through sudden collapse, but through slow erosion. Each year, the treasury carried a little less power. Each coin held a little less value. Each complaint from soldiers, merchants, and ordinary families carried a little more frustration. The empire felt its strength thinning, though it did not yet understand the scale of the threat. And so the stage was set for the next phase of decline. Desperate fiscal choices made in the hope of restoring stability. Choices that would seem reasonable in the moment, yet deepen the very problems they tried to solve. As the Ottoman treasury felt its strength thinning, officials searched for remedies that offered quick relief. None intended to weaken the empire. Each believed they were applying temporary solutions to temporary problems. Yet history often turns on decisions made in moments of quiet desperation. And in dim offices scattered throughout the capital, the empire began choosing shortcuts that would echo far longer than anyone imagined. One of the first measures seemed almost practical: selling government positions. A post that once required talent, training, or years of service could now be purchased for the right price. Buyers were usually wealthy men eager for influence, not responsibility. They entered office expecting a return on their investment, and they found it easiest to extract that return from the people beneath them. Competence slipped, integrity thinned. Decisions that should have strengthened provinces instead padded private purses. The state gained money once, but lost something far more valuable: trust. Soon after, another policy gained traction: renting tax rights to private collectors. Instead of gathering taxes directly, the empire auctioned the right to do so. Bidders offered large sums up front, then squeezed as much as they could from the population to recoup their payment and turn a profit. The system filled the treasury quickly, but it created a darker cost. Peasants felt the pressure immediately. Collectors pushed harder than state officials ever would, punishing late payments, raising demands, and ignoring local conditions. Resentment grew quietly in villages and towns, spreading in ways no official report ever fully captured. Borrowing against future revenue became another quiet habit. Faced with rising expenses and shrinking income, the empire turned to loans it expected to repay when conditions improved. Each loan solved an immediate problem: paying troops, repairing roads, supplying administrators, but every borrowing narrowed the possibilities for tomorrow. The future became a place already spoken for, its resources claimed before they arrived. People lived with the illusion of stability, unaware that the ground beneath them had been traded away piece by piece. At the same time, the military began feeling the strain. Armies that once marched with the finest equipment received lesser armor, outdated weapons, and reduced supplies. Workshops that had forged quality goods now produced cheaper versions to stretch budgets. Commanders requested more support and received polite reassurances instead. Soldiers grumbled, then worried, then grew resentful. How could they defend the empire when the empire no longer equipped them to succeed? The decline was subtle, but unmistakable to those who depended on the tools of war. Each of these decisions made sense when viewed alone. Officials considered them efficient, clever, even necessary. They believed the problems were short-term inconveniences that good fortune would eventually correct. Yet together, these choices formed a web of consequences that touched every corner of the empire. Selling offices encouraged corruption, renting tax rights fed local anger, borrowing fixed nothing and deepened future crises, under-equipping the military weakened the empire's most vital shield. None of these measures addressed the core issue, declining revenue, and all of them eroded the foundations that once held the state firmly in place. The tragedy was not in the decisions themselves, but in how easily they blended into normal practice. No one stood in the palace courtyard declaring that the empire had chosen a dangerous path. Instead, the decline unfolded in quiet rooms, lit by oil lamps, where officials believed they were protecting the realm through practical adjustments. It is often this way. Empires fall not through grand betrayals, but through ordinary choices that appear harmless until viewed from a distance. By the time the consequences became visible, the patterns were already deeply rooted. Administrators expected positions to be bought. Tax collectors expected to press hard. Treasury officials expected to borrow. Soldiers expected disappointment. The system had reshaped itself around shortcuts, and returning to older, sturdier methods felt impossible. This growing strain on finances did not remain contained within ledgers or coffers. It soon reached the empire's military, once the beating heart of Ottoman power, where its effects transformed not just budgets, but the very identity of the forces meant to defend the realm. And so we move toward the next chapter, where the empire's soldiers begin reflecting the internal decay that had been forming for generations. There was a time when the Janissaries stood at the very center of Ottoman power, a force so disciplined and feared that their name alone could steady the empire's borders. They marched in silence, moved as one, and trained with a dedication that seemed almost otherworldly. Chosen young, separated from ordinary life, and shaped through relentless instruction, they became warriors who embodied the empire's ideals. Foreign envoys wrote in awe of their precision. Cities trembled when their banners approached. Even within the empire, they inspired a mixture of respect and unease, for they represented not only military strength, but the unbreakable will of the state. But strength rarely fades all at once. It softens gradually, slipping into comfort long before anyone recognizes the change. The Janissaries' decline began quietly, not with open revolt, but with subtle privileges that seemed harmless at first. Rules that once kept them separate from civilian life began loosening. They were allowed to marry, to own shops, to take part in the rhythms of the city. These changes felt small concessions made to ease growing discontent or reward years of service. Yet each one nudged the core away from the strict discipline that had defined its power. Soon, bribes found their way into the recruitment process. Families that once feared losing a son to the elite corps now sought entry for the opportunities it offered. A place in the Janissaries no longer required the pure, demanding path it once had. Influence replaced merit. Connections replaced skill. Young men entered the corps not because they were destined for military excellence, but because the position promised income, protection, and prestige. The transformation was not sudden. It unfolded over decades, almost politely, hidden in the comfortable pace of everyday life. Training, once the heart of Janissary identity, slowly weakened. Drills shortened, discipline softened, duties blurred into social privileges. Some members spent more time running businesses or socializing in coffee houses than preparing for battle. An institution built to forge soldiers became a community of increasingly settled men who valued their status more than their purpose. The decline was not dramatic. It was quiet, cushioned by routine, and justified by tradition. No alarms rang. No proclamations warned of danger. The shift simply continued, step by step, until the corps no longer resembled the elite force it had once been. And as their military edge dulled, their political presence sharpened. Living in the capital, woven into urban life, the Janissaries developed networks of influence that reached deep into the palace. They attended ceremonies, influenced decisions, and built alliances with merchants, officials, and court factions. Ministers learned that gaining Janissary support could stabilize their careers, while their opposition could end them. Over time, the corps became a political force capable of shaping imperial policy. The guardians of the empire no longer served merely as defenders. They became gatekeepers, deciding which reforms could pass and which would be crushed before they took root. This new power hardened into something dangerous. Whenever a sultan or minister attempted to modernize the army, introduce new regulations, or challenge old privileges, the Janissaries responded with resistance. Some reforms were quietly undermined. Others faced open rebellion. Their loyalty was no longer to the discipline that had once defined them, but to the comfort and influence they had accumulated. The empire needed modernization to survive a rapidly changing world, yet every attempt to adjust threatened the Janissaries' authority, and so they fought not for the empire's future, but for their own present. The revelation is unsettling. The very institution created to protect the state became one of the greatest obstacles to saving it. Reformers, desperate to strengthen the empire, found themselves facing a core determined to preserve a status quo that no longer served the realm. Each resistance deepened the empire's vulnerability. Each refusal to change widened the gap between Ottoman military capability and the innovations reshaping Europe. The core that had once brought glory now anchored the empire to its past. Still, their decline did not feel like betrayal to those within. Many believed they were defending tradition, protecting their rights, or resisting unnecessary risks. They did not see themselves as obstructing survival. History's tragedies often arise from such sincere misunderstandings when those who believe they are safeguarding the world inadvertently hasten its unraveling. As the Janissaries tightened their grip on politics and loosened their grip on discipline, the empire's leaders faced a painful dilemma. Without reform, the empire would weaken, but with reform, the Janissaries would revolt. This tension created the storm that shaped the next chapter, where attempts to modernize the army collided with a force unwilling to relinquish its fading authority. And so we moved toward the moment when the empire tried to change and learned how dangerous it had become to challenge those who once guarded it. Reform in the Ottoman Empire often began with hope, quiet, cautious, but genuine. Sultans who saw the world changing around them understood that the empire could not survive on memory alone. European armies were evolving, adopting new drills, new weapons, new strategies. The Ottomans, once unmatched on the battlefield, now lagged behind. A few brave rulers recognized the danger and attempted to modernize the military. Yet every step toward progress collided with a force far more powerful than any foreign enemy, the resistance of their own Janissaries. The first reforms were modest. A sultan would issue a decree calling for updated training routines. A new regiment, modeled on European techniques, would be formed quietly. Foreign advisors were invited to demonstrate modern tactics, hoping to breathe fresh life into an aging system. These decrees were often read aloud in cold palace halls, the sound of the words echoing off marble walls as ministers nodded politely. On the surface, it seemed progress was finally beginning. But outside those halls, the Janissaries listened with growing unease. Reform threatened their privileges, their influence, and the comfortable world they had built for themselves. They feared that new soldiers, trained in ways they did not understand, might replace them. They feared losing the power they wielded in the capital. And above all, they feared discipline, returning to a core that no longer wished to be disciplined. So they did what any entrenched power structure does when threatened. They began to plot. Their meetings did not take place in secret chambers or shadowy alleyways. They gathered in coffee houses, in guild halls, in the corners of barracks where conversation blended easily with the murmur of daily life. They spoke in guarded tones, testing the mood, sharing frustrations, and weighing how far the Sultan intended to push change. And when they sensed that reform would challenge their authority, they responded with swift defiance. Riots erupted with surprising speed. Crowds surged through streets shouting demands. Ministers who supported modernization were dragged from their positions. Palaces were stormed. Barracks thundered with anger. Reformers who believed they were saving the empire suddenly realized they had placed themselves in grave danger. Some fled in disguise. Some were exiled. Others met far darker ends. Each attempt at progress dissolved into fear and chaos, leaving the empire shaken and humiliated. The tragedy was not in the violence itself, but in its repetitive rhythm. Time after time, sultans attempted to push the army forward, and time after time they were forced to retreat. The Janissaries learned that they could shape history simply by resisting. They discovered that if they stood together, the palace would yield. And so, with every failed reform, their confidence grew, while the empire's ability to adapt shrank. The sultans, witnessing the consequences, became hesitant. Even those who understood the urgency of modernization hesitated before issuing new decrees. They calculated risks, weighed potential backlash, and often chose silence over confrontation. It is a dangerous thing when leaders fear their own protectors more than their rivals. Reform became a fragile dream, stifled not by lack of vision, but by the certainty that vision would bring revolt. Meanwhile, the world beyond the empire moved quickly. European armies refined their tactics, mastered gunpowder technology, and developed systems of discipline that could overwhelm older methods. Each year widened the gap between the Ottoman forces and those they might one day face. The empire did not fail to modernize because it lacked awareness. It failed because its internal structures refused to allow change. The Janissaries had transformed from guardians into barriers, from protectors into obstacles. And so the empire drifted further from the military strength it once knew. The attempts at reform did not crumble in silence. They were met with fire, shouts, and the collapse of hope. Each failed effort deepened the understanding that the state could not overcome the power structures within it. The Ottoman rulers were trapped, unable to move forward without tearing their own system apart. This pattern of resistance had consequences that stretched far beyond military barracks. As the empire entered a new century, the world embraced innovations the Ottomans could not adopt. This widening gap leads us to the next stage of decline, where military stagnation becomes unmistakable, and the global transformation leaves the empire struggling to keep pace. Across Europe, the face of war was changing. Armies that once marched in loose formations began drilling with almost mechanical precision. Cannon crews practiced routines timed to the second. New manuals standardized behavior across entire regiments, transforming soldiers from scattered fighters into coordinated machines. Workshops produced smoother barrels, better fuses, and artillery pieces capable of hitting targets with accuracy that would have astonished earlier generations. Navies replaced aging galleys with broad-hulled ships that carried more guns, sailed faster, and fought in disciplined lines. A wave of innovation swept across the continent, reshaping warfare from the ground up. But the Ottoman Empire, once the fearsome master of siege warfare and swift cavalry strikes, did not ride that wave. It watched from a distance, confident that its old methods remained sufficient. The empire had once been the innovator, the power others studied. Yet by the 18th century, time moved faster than its willingness to adapt. In Ottoman shipyards, workers still assembled vessels with techniques carried from earlier centuries. The rhythmic clang of hammers on wood and metal echoed through dry docks, but the ships emerging from these yards lagged behind their European counterparts. Their hulls were slower, their cannons fewer, their maneuverability limited. Commanders who had grown up mastering the currents of the Mediterranean found themselves facing fleets shaped by new science, new engineering, and new strategies. On land, the contrast was even sharper. European artillery officers trained rigorously in mathematics and engineering. They calculated angles, measured distances, and understood the physics that governed every shot. Ottoman cannons, though once formidable, had not kept pace. Many were heavy, outdated, or imprecise. They fired loudly but not reliably, and the crews operating them often relied on inherited knowledge, rather than standardized instruction. Tactics, too, carried the imprint of earlier ages. Ottoman commanders deployed troops in formations that had served their ancestors well, unaware that those same formations were becoming dangerously obsolete. Battles now required rapid communication, coordinated volleys, and adaptable units capable of responding to shifting circumstances. But within the empire, officers resisted these changes, either out of habit or out of fear that adopting foreign methods would undermine tradition. None of these shortcomings caused immediate catastrophe. The empire still won battles, it still fielded large armies, it still projected the image of a powerful state. Yet beneath that surface, a quiet imbalance grew. Each year, Europe advanced a little further, while the Ottomans stood still, confident in methods that no longer matched the battlefield's reality. The gap widened slowly, almost politely, until one day it became too large to ignore. The feeling of dread emerged not from defeat but from comparison. When Ottoman observers were sent to study European armies, they returned with reports that read like warnings layered beneath admiration. They described drills that ran like clockwork, gunnery schools that produced precise officers, and naval fleets that moved as a single entity rather than scattered clusters of ships. Their words floated through the palace, unsettling those who understood them, and irritating those who preferred not to be reminded that the world outside was shifting. But reforms required courage, and courage meant confronting entrenched interests. Every attempt to modernize the army clashed with the Janissaries, whose resistance made progress almost impossible. The empire had lost not only its technical edge, but its ability to evolve. Decline came not from a single defeat, but from a refusal to adjust the fundamental elements of warfare. This truth carries a quiet weight. An empire can lose its place in history, not because its enemies overpower it, but because it cannot keep pace with the passage of time. The Ottomans watched Europe transform its armies into engines of precision, while their own forces drifted deeper into outdated habits, slowed by comfort and constrained by internal politics. And so the empire slipped into a world for which it was no longer prepared. The battlefield had changed, the Ottomans had not. What followed was not only military frustration but a deeper vulnerability, one that foreign powers would learn to exploit, not just through war, but through diplomacy, influence, and subtle pressure. This brings us to the next turning point, where the empire's internal weaknesses met the ambitions of other nations, shaping a century defined as much by negotiation as by conflict. Foreign influence does not always enter a nation through conquest. Sometimes it arrives through open doors, carried by merchants with polite smiles, diplomats with patient voices, and missionaries who claim to offer guidance. For the Ottoman Empire, European presence seeped in gradually, like a slow-moving mist curling into every corner of public life. What began as trade and diplomacy evolved into something subtler, deeper, and far more binding. In the coffee houses of Istanbul, smoke hung thick above wooden tables, where conversations drifted between languages. French, Italian, Greek, Arabic, Turkish voices overlapped in a soft, layered murmur. Envoys from European courts sat quietly in back corners, sipping strong coffee as they observed debates among scholars, merchants, and minor officials. These diplomats were skilled listeners. They watched how decisions were made, noted who held power, and sensed where pressure could be applied. The empire's internal weaknesses were not hidden to them. They saw the gaps that corruption and complacency had created, and they understood how to slip between them. Treaties, signed in calm, sunlit chambers, often carried the appearance of mutual cooperation. European representatives presented their terms with delicate courtesy, masking agendas behind promises of friendship and prosperity. They offered trade privileges, expert advisors, and technical knowledge. In return, they gained footholds small at first, barely noticeable. A consulate here, a trade exemption there, access to certain ports, influence over certain industries. Each agreement, signed with good intentions, quietly shifted the balance of power. Missionaries arrived with books and sermons, establishing schools and hospitals that earned local respect. Their presence was not threatening. It felt charitable, even welcome. Yet through these institutions, European ideas, loyalties, and networks spread among communities that had once looked only toward the empire's center. These missionaries were not soldiers, but their influence worked like a subtle tide, shaping minds and forging connections that extended outward beyond Ottoman control. Merchants played their own role. They arrived with goods that dazzled buyers, fabrics dyed in colors rarely seen, clocks with precise mechanisms, and weapons forged with new European techniques. They brought not just commodities but relationships. Many became trusted partners to Ottoman traders, and through these relationships, valuable information passed effortlessly from one world to another. Prices, shortages, rumors, political shifts, every detail was quietly collected and sent back to European capitals, eager to understand the empire's condition. What made this infiltration so effective was its gentleness. Nothing felt like invasion. Everything felt like exchange. But behind the softness, European powers were mapping the empire's vulnerabilities. They saw the friction between the palace and the provinces. They recognized the growing strain between military factions and reformers. They detected the unease rising in communities who felt disconnected from Istanbul's decisions. And once they understood these fractures, they used them. Aid and expertise were offered at exactly the right moments, creating subtle forms of dependency. When the empire needed loans, Europe provided them with conditions. When the empire needed weapons, Europe sold them at prices that ensured further reliance. When the empire sought diplomatic support, Europe agreed while extracting concessions. Each gesture appeared helpful, but each one deepened the empire's reliance on external powers, weaving invisible chains around its sovereignty. In council rooms where officials debated foreign proposals, European ambassadors stood with serene confidence, knowing the empire had fewer options each year. They did not need to threaten force. The empire's own shortages, debts, and internal tensions made compliance seem reasonable. And with every agreement, Europe gained more influence over Ottoman affairs, sometimes openly, sometimes through quiet persuasion, whispered at dinners, receptions, or private meetings. The empire's rulers did not always realize how much ground had been surrendered. Many believed they were maintaining balance in a changing world. They told themselves these relationships were temporary, strategic, necessary. But the truth moved beneath their assumptions like an undercurrent. European influence had grown not through force, but through patience and precision. This is how a powerful state can be conquered without a single cannon being fired, by allowing others to shape its choices, direct its economy, and nurture its internal divisions. And these internal divisions were about to become far more dangerous. For as European influence expanded, new ideas began stirring in the empire's provinces, ideas of identity, independence, and nationhood. These whispers, once faint, soon gained the strength to become movements. And so we move to the next chapter, where foreign powers began supporting nationalist unrest, setting the stage for crises the empire could no longer contain. Across the vast territories of the Ottoman Empire, a quiet awakening began to stir. It did not start with armies or proclamations, but with whispers, soft, uncertain, and passed between people who felt something shifting inside them. For centuries, the empire had embraced many languages, religions, and customs. Diversity had been one of its greatest strengths, a sign of its ability to contain multitudes within a single political world. But as economic pressure tightened and military weaknesses became evident, that diversity began to transform into something more fragile. Under strain, difference no longer felt like richness. It felt like separation. In mountain villages of Greece, priests gathered small groups in dimly lit rooms, reading from pamphlets imported secretly from European printers. These texts spoke of ancient glories, lost kingdoms, and the possibility of rebirth. The words were not shouted, they were murmured, shared like a delicate secret. People listened with a mixture of longing and fear. They wondered, many for the first time, whether they belonged to a history different from the one the empire had written for them. In the valleys and forests of Serbia, villagers met in quiet clearings where the sounds of nature shielded their conversations. They spoke of autonomy, of justice, of identities they felt slipping out of the empire's hands. Foreign agents, travelling under the guise of merchants or travellers, offered encouragement, money, or simply ideas. These small gestures carried enormous weight. They planted the belief that the world outside recognized these communities as something more than subjects of a distant sultan. Egypt, with its ancient memory and strategic importance, felt similar tremors. The influence of European advisors, merchants, and soldiers reshaped the region's sense of itself. Local leaders began seeing their destiny not as a continuation of Ottoman tradition, but as a future rooted in their own land. Intellectual circles discussed reform, independence, and the idea that Egypt could stand apart. More and more people started to imagine a life no longer bound to Istanbul's decisions. These movements did not emerge suddenly. They grew quietly, layer by layer, fed by the empire's weakening authority and the rising confidence of local leaders. Language, religion, and regional culture became markers of distinction rather than threads that wove the empire together. The sense of belonging that had once bound millions under the Ottoman banner began to fade. People realized they had identities older, deeper, and more personal than the political identity imposed upon them. European powers recognized this shift early and acted with careful calculation. They sent books, teachers, and priests who spoke of national pride and self-determination. They funded local leaders who promised autonomy. They encouraged newspapers that carried messages of cultural revival. These foreign influences did not light the fire of nationalism, but they fanned it. Every act of support reinforced the belief that independence was not only possible, but welcomed. The empire, strained by financial crises and military stagnation, struggled to respond. Its systems were too slow, its communication too fractured, and its leadership too hesitant to address the rising tide. The Janissaries resisted the reforms needed to stabilize the state. Provincial governors acted with increasing independence. Tax burdens weighed heavily on communities already struggling with inflation. In this environment, Nationalism felt not like rebellion, but like survival. The emotional transformation was subtle but profound. People who had once accepted their Ottoman identity without question now looked inward and saw something else. A Greek farmer felt connected to a story stretching back to ancient heroes. A Serbian shepherd imagined joining a new movement promising freedom. An Egyptian merchant pictured a future shaped by local decisions, not distant decrees. These realizations unfolded quietly, one household at a time, until they formed a collective consciousness that could no longer be contained. The empire's diversity, its mosaic of cultures, had once symbolized harmony. But now, under economic strain and political turmoil, that mosaic began to fracture along its natural lines. Where people saw difference, they once saw unity. Now, they saw separation. And once that idea took root, it grew quickly. This was the new fire spreading across the provinces. A belief that identity could stand apart from empire, that loyalty could shift away from the center, and that a future beyond Ottoman rule was not only imaginable, but increasingly inevitable. As this fire burned quietly but steadily, the empire faced an impossible challenge: how to reclaim loyalty in a world where millions had already begun to drift away in their hearts. And this leads us to the next chapter of the story, where the Ottomans attempted to restore unity, only to watch their efforts unravel in the face of forces they could no longer control. By the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire could no longer ignore the shifting world around it. Nationalist uprisings spread through the provinces, European powers tightened their influence, and the military lagged behind modern armies. The state needed change, deep, structural change, and so the Tanzimat era began. Reformers stepped forward with ambitious plans, believing that modernization might restore the strength the empire had slowly lost. They envisioned a future shaped by new schools, modern laws, and promises of equality meant to bind a fractured population back together. The intentions were sincere. Ministers drafted legal codes inspired by European systems. New schools opened in major cities where young men studied science, mathematics, and foreign languages. Newspapers spread new ideas with surprising speed, giving ordinary people access to discussions once limited to small intellectual circles. Reform decrees were read in public squares, their words filled with hope. Equality for all subjects, protection under the law, and a vision of a shared Ottoman identity that transcended religion or ethnicity. For a moment, it seemed the empire might rediscover unity through progress. But reform works only when it arrives before the threads holding a society together begin to fray. In the Ottoman case, reformers acted after decades of strain had already taken their toll. People had grown distant from the capital, shaped more by local identities than imperial loyalty. Nationalist ideas had taken root in communities that once accepted the empire without question. Economic problems created resentment. In this environment, even the most promising reforms struggled to find fertile ground. Instead of healing divisions, the Tanzimat reforms often exposed them. The empire promised equality, but many groups felt the promises came too late or favored others at their expense. Non-Muslims, granted new legal protections, saw opportunities they had been denied before. Muslims, who had long enjoyed privileged status, feared losing their place in a society already changing faster than they could accept. What was meant to create unity instead stirred anxieties that deepened existing fractures. Modern schools produced educated young people who returned to their homes with new expectations and new frustrations. They saw the gap between reformist ideals and the slow reality of bureaucratic change. They recognized corruption more sharply than their elders and questioned why the empire struggled to implement the values it now taught. Ironically, the very institutions designed to save the empire produced citizens more aware of its weaknesses. Foreign powers, watching closely, found new openings. They supported communities who felt disappointed by the empire's uneven reforms. They offered scholarships, loans, and diplomatic protection, reinforcing the idea that identities beyond Ottoman held greater promise. What was meant to bind the population together inadvertently empowered separatist movements, accelerating the shift toward independence. Even within the government, reform revealed uncomfortable truths. Ministers who advocated modernization clashed with conservative factions, clinging to older systems. Some believed reform diluted traditional authority, others feared the Janissaries' lingering influence. Many simply worried about the cost. The The bureaucracy, already weakened by years of self-censorship, struggled to enforce new policies consistently. Some regions embraced the changes, others resisted or ignored them entirely. The empire seemed to move in several directions at once, unable to coordinate its own transformation. This was the tragedy at the heart of the Tanzimat. Modernization without stability pushes a fragile state closer to collapse. Reforms created hope, confusion, resentment, and aspiration all at the same time. They were too bold for some, too gentle for others, and too late for many. The empire found itself caught between the world it wanted to join and the world it could no longer sustain. For ordinary people, the reforms felt like distant speeches drifting across landscapes, already shaped by fear, uncertainty, and shifting identities. The capital dreamed of unity, while the provinces drifted further apart. The state offered promises when what people needed was trust rebuilt over generations, and trust cannot be restored by decree. As the Tanzimat era unfolded, it became clear that the empire was trying to leap forward while its foundation still crumbled beneath it. Each reform revealed what had already been lost, rather than what could still be saved. The Ottomans had entered an age where even progress carried the shadow of decline. And so, we turn now to the palace itself, the heart of the empire, where sultans, advisors, and factions shaped these reforms in rooms far removed from the world they hoped to influence. The Ottoman sultans lived at the center of a world crafted to feel serene, orderly, and eternal. Within the palace walls, life unfolded with a calm precision that made the empire seem unshakable. Gardens stretched beneath carved balconies, where fountains whispered into marble pools. The scent of jasmine drifted through shaded courtyards. Servants moved quietly across polished floors, never disturbing the peaceful rhythm of the palace. To an observer, it might have seemed the perfect environment for wise rule. But serenity, when enforced as insulation, becomes its own kind of blindness. Over time, the palace developed a system that shielded the Sultan from anything that might disrupt his calm. Access to him was carefully controlled. Officials filtered visitors, deciding who could speak and what could be said. Reports from distant provinces were reviewed before they reached his chambers. A trouble was softened into inconvenience. Crisis was described as a minor setback. Advisors who wished to remain in favor learned to deliver only the most palatable versions of events. The truth still existed within the palace, but it arrived heavily wrapped in caution, shaped to protect the listener rather than the realm. Many sultans were not weak or indifferent. Several possessed capable minds and genuine concern for the empire's future. But even the most intelligent ruler cannot act wisely when the world shown to him is incomplete. As years passed, the palace became a place where good leaders made poor choices simply because they lacked accurate knowledge. They believed the empire's systems remained steady, unaware of how deeply corruption had taken root. They believed uprisings abroad were isolated, not realizing that dissatisfaction had grown into a spreading fire. They believed their armies were loyal and prepared, not knowing how hollow the Janissaries' discipline had become. The palace courtiers understood the risks of honesty. A blunt report could anger the Sultan or damage an official's standing. A warning delivered too strongly might be interpreted as disrespect or disloyalty. And so, to preserve their positions, men who held the empire's fate in their hands learned to whisper reassurances rather than raise alarms. They became experts in managing impressions. When good news was scarce, they presented partial truths. When rumors circulated, they buried them beneath compliments. What the Sultan heard was not false, but it was never the full picture. This created an atmosphere where decisions floated in a calm that did not match reality. The Sultan might stroll through his gardens, listening to nightingales while believing the provinces were stable, unaware that new loyalties had taken root far beyond the palace. He might approve military budgets, thinking they were sufficient, unaware that equipment shortages had already weakened the army. He might review treasury reports showing balanced numbers, unaware that those numbers were the product of selective accounting and hopeful adjustments. The empire slipped further into crisis, while its ruler remained surrounded by carefully crafted tranquility. The psychological toll of this insulation is easy to overlook. To lead is to carry responsibility, yet these sultans were deprived of the information needed to bear that burden effectively. They were praised more than advised, protected more than informed. In moments of uncertainty, they relied on the very people who feared their displeasure. The palace became a place where the appearance of stability mattered more than the pursuit of it. And once an emperor rules through illusions, those illusions become the boundaries of his world. Even when suspicion crept in, even when a sultan sensed that something was being concealed, the structure surrounding him made it difficult to uncover the truth. Advisors would reassure him. Ministers would deny rumors. Reports would be revised. By the time accurate information reached him, the damage had already progressed. This is one of history's quieter tragedies. Rulers who might have steered their empire differently were left navigating a landscape drawn by others. Their errors were not the result of malice or incompetence, but of isolation. They ruled a world they could no longer see clearly. And this blindness extended beyond governance into the heart of palace life itself, where succession, intrigue, and internal politics shaped decisions long before they reached the throne. That deeper struggle is where we now turn toward the fragile system that determined who would inherit power and how prepared they would be to bear it. The throne of the Ottoman Empire was once the pinnacle of worldly power, a seat occupied by men shaped through rigorous training, careful mentorship, and years of experience watching their elders govern. But as centuries passed, the path to becoming a sultan grew narrower, quieter, and far more fragile. The empire that once produced leaders through challenge and exposure began producing them through confinement and caution. The crown remained brilliant, but the preparation behind it dimmed. In earlier eras, princes travelled with military campaigns, observed council meetings, and learned the complex art of rule by watching their fathers manage crises. They listened to seasoned advisors, studied languages and philosophy, and saw firsthand how decisions shaped the fate of millions. Over time, however, succession grew tangled in fear. Rival princes were viewed less as potential future rulers and more as threats. To protect the stability of the throne, heirs were hidden away. They lived in carefully arranged chambers, surrounded by attendants, but cut off from the living world of governance. Training halls that once buzzed with instruction fell silent. Advisors who once guided young princes with stern wisdom were dismissed or reassigned. In their place came tutors, whose primary task was to ensure calm, not competence. The heirs were taught reading, religion, and court etiquette, but they were shielded from the realities of the empire they were destined to rule. They rarely saw the provinces, met military commanders, or witnessed the negotiations that shaped foreign policy. Instead, they grew up in an environment designed to keep them safe, an environment that also kept them unprepared. When these sheltered princes finally ascended to the throne, they entered a world they had never been allowed to understand. Decisions fell into their hands before they even knew how to ask the right questions. They faced ministers skilled at shaping narratives, Janissaries accustomed to influencing policy, and a bureaucracy that whispered rather than spoke clearly. Many young sultans hesitated not because they lacked intelligence, but because they lacked experience. The empire expected them to lead, yet had raised them in conditions that prevented them from learning how. The sorrow of this era lies not in blaming these rulers, but in recognizing the quiet tragedy of their circumstances. They inherited a system weakened by internal decay, external pressure, and decades of accumulated problems. Yet they were denied the tools their ancestors had once considered essential. When crises emerged, they often relied on advisors who themselves feared losing influence. When reform was needed, they struggled to judge which proposals were wise and which were manipulations. Their leadership was shaped by uncertainty, a calm on the surface, masking deep vulnerability. Some sultans tried earnestly to rise above their limitations. They studied diligently once they reached the throne. They sought counsel from scholars, attempted reforms, or travelled through the empire to gain first-hand understanding. Yet the weight of the office often pressed too heavily on shoulders, never trained to bear it. Inexperience made them susceptible to palace factions eager to gain advantage. Decisions that required steady, seasoned judgment were filtered through layers of intrigue. Even the most determined sultans found themselves pulled into currents they could not navigate alone. This fragile system of succession also bred instability. When a ruler died unexpectedly or prematurely, the empire sometimes turned to a young prince who had spent most of his life in seclusion. He would ascend suddenly, thrust from a protected world into a position that demanded immediate authority. The palace prepared the ceremonies, the court bowed respectfully, and the empire held its breath, hoping the new sultan would learn quickly. But hope could not replace experience, and the gap between expectation and ability widened with each new succession. Over time, the role of the Sultan shifted from active leadership to symbolic presence. Real power drifted toward advisors, military elites, and the complex web of palace politics that had grown stronger as the sultans grew weaker. The throne still stood at the heart of the empire, polished and revered, but it no longer guided the state with the same clarity. The sultan's authority became something ceremonial, invoked more often than exercised. This transformation was not the result of one weak ruler or one poor decision. It was the cumulative effect of generations shaped by isolation, caution, and a system that valued security over preparation. The empire continued to honor the sultan as the shadow of his ancestors, yet the world he inherited demanded strength he had never been trained to wield. And within this delicate balance of youth, inexperience, and political pressure, another force stirred, one that operated even closer to the throne. For beyond the formal councils and military elites lay a world of influence woven through family ties, private alliances, and whispered ambitions. To understand the next stage of the empire's decline, we must move into the heart of palace life itself, the harem and the court politics that shaped the decisions long before a sultan ever signed his name. Within the heart of the Ottoman palace, where polished marble reflected lantern light and footsteps softened into silence, power did not move in straight lines. It drifted through corridors, exchanged hands in quiet conversations, and settled in places the public never saw. The empire's official structures, councils, offices, ceremonies still existed, still performed their roles, still appeared to guide decisions. But the true currents of influence ran underneath, shaped not by laws or institutions, but by relationships, rivalries, and the subtle ambitions of those closest to the throne. The Grand Vizier, nominally the Sultan's chief advisor, often wielded more practical authority than the ruler himself. Some viziers were brilliant administrators who tried to steer the state with clarity, while others used their position to secure wealth, alliances, and personal survival. Their power depended not only on competence, but on their ability to navigate the palace's shifting loyalties. A vizier who rose too quickly made enemies. One who hesitated risked irrelevance. Each decision he presented to the Sultan had already passed through layers of calculation, how it might please some factions, irritate others, or shift the delicate balance that held the court together. Beyond the administrative halls lay the harem, misunderstood by outsiders yet central to palace politics. Here, influence grew in soft tones rather than raised voices. Mothers, sisters, and wives of sultans formed networks of trust and allegiance. A single whisper from a favored consort could change a career. A quiet suggestion from the Valide Sultan, the sultan's mother, could redirect policy. These women did not command armies or hold official titles, but they shaped the emotional and political world of the ruler. Their alliances with advisors, eunuchs, and household officials formed an invisible scaffolding that supported or destabilized the men who governed the empire. Eunuchs, too, held crucial roles. They controlled access to the sultan, managed internal communications, and oversaw the daily rhythms of palace life. Their loyalty was essential because their position allowed them to influence who spoke to the ruler and when. A message delayed could become a crisis. A message softened could alter a decision. Their discretion made them indispensable, and their proximity to the throne made them powerful. The combined effect of these forces created an environment where policy emerged not from unified strategy, but from negotiations among competing interests. When a vizier suggested a reform, he did so knowing that palace factions might resist it. When a provincial complaint reached the capital, its reception depended on which advisor read it first. A military strategy might be endorsed not because it was wise, but because it benefited the faction that happened to hold the Sultan's ear at that moment. Power became something fluid, constantly renegotiated, shaped by alliances that formed and dissolved with little warning. This internal tug-of-war meant the empire increasingly struggled to act with coherence. The needs of distant provinces faded behind palace intrigues. Decisions meant to support the empire as a whole were often compromised to maintain harmony among factions. The state still functioned, but its motivations shifted. Instead of prioritizing stability across continents, it prioritized stability within the palace walls. Instead of confronting external threats, it spent energy managing internal rivalries. The empire's grand machinery continued turning, yet its purpose had subtly changed. The tragedy of this period lies in its subtlety. There were no dramatic betrayals, no sudden coups, no scenes of open rebellion within the palace. The decline unfolded through small choices made for personal advantage rather than collective good. Loyalty networks grew stronger than laws. Whispers held more weight than decrees. And the Sultan, already isolated by upbringing and the filtered information of his advisors, relied increasingly on a system where decisions reflected courtly dynamics more than the realities of the empire. In this world of soft influence and quiet maneuvering, the Ottoman Empire still appeared grand to outsiders. Envoys saw splendid ceremonies and elaborate titles. They did not see the rivalries hidden behind polite bows, or the calculations woven into every word spoken near the throne. Yet it was these undercurrents that shaped the empire's fate. As the palace became consumed by its own internal gravity, the broader society beyond its walls began to stagnate. Innovation slowed, intellectual curiosity dimmed, and cultural life shifted from vibrancy to repetition. And so we move now to the next chapter, where the empire's social and cultural foundations, once rich and dynamic, began settling into patterns that would leave it unprepared for the world changing around it. Long before empires fall in battle or collapse under financial strain, they fade in quieter places, inside libraries, where the pages of new ideas stop turning, inside minds that once burned with discovery, but now settle into repetition. For the Ottoman Empire, the intellectual decline did not begin with crisis, but with stillness. Curiosity, once a vibrant force that pushed scholars to explore the world, slowly grew quiet. In earlier centuries, the empire had been a center of learning. Astronomers charted the heavens from lofty observatories. Mathematicians debated theories that echoed across continents. Physicians studied ancient manuscripts, then expanded upon them with insights gathered from their own observations. Knowledge was not merely preserved, it was questioned, tested, and reshaped. The empire's greatest scholars were celebrated not for copying the past but for challenging it. But as the world changed, the empire's relationship with knowledge shifted. The pursuit of inquiry gave way to the comfort of tradition. Scholars still filled libraries, but the atmosphere had changed. Instead of studying the unknown, they revisited the same old texts, their hands tracing words written centuries before. Works once meant to inspire new thought became objects of ritual study. Learning became a quiet act of preservation rather than exploration. Inside madrasas, young students memorized passages with precision, but often without curiosity. They learned what their teachers had learned, repeating ideas passed down through generations without asking whether the world had shifted since those words were written. Knowledge became something inherited rather than discovered. The empire's intellectual life settled into patterns that dulled innovation, even as scientific revolutions erupted elsewhere. This stagnation was not the result of a single decree or a deliberate rejection of progress. It grew slowly from cultural habits that favored stability over change. Scholars who suggested new ideas risked being dismissed as disruptive. Traditionalists held enormous influence, guiding educational institutions toward the comfort of the familiar. Curiosity requires permission to wander, and in this era, wandering was quietly discouraged. Meanwhile, beyond the empire's borders, Europe experienced seismic shifts in thought. Telescopes revealed unseen stars. Experiments challenged long-held theories. Printing presses spread ideas at a pace unimaginable in earlier centuries. The world raced forward with new methods of inquiry, new philosophies, new sciences. But within the Ottoman Empire, the intellectual landscape remained largely anchored to earlier times. The decline was not immediately visible. Libraries still stood, their shelves heavy with manuscripts. Scholars still gathered for discussions. Students still recited lessons in crowded halls. But beneath this appearance of continuity, something vital had faded. The empire no longer generated new knowledge at the pace it once had. The spark that drives societies to question the world, to probe its mysteries, and to expand human understanding had dimmed. This was more than an academic issue. It shaped the empire's ability to respond to its changing world. When military technology advanced, fewer minds were prepared to adapt. When new scientific methods emerged, few institutions were positioned to adopt them. And when philosophical movements reshaped other civilizations, the empire remained rooted in interpretations that no longer aligned with the global shift. Without intellectual renewal, even the most powerful state becomes vulnerable to forces it cannot understand or anticipate. Yet this decline carried a quiet sadness, rather than dramatic tragedy. Scholars did not stop working, they simply stopped questioning. The libraries did not empty, they simply grew still. The intellectual life of the empire did not collapse, it settled into a gentle lethargy, as though time itself had slowed within those walls. It was not a failure of intelligence, but a loss of wonder. And that loss reveals something essential. Civilizations thrive not only on knowledge, but on the willingness to ask what lies beyond what they already know. When a society stops asking questions, it stops evolving. It becomes a guardian of its past, rather than a seeker of its future. As we move forward, the next section turns to the roots of this decline, the education system that shaped generations. For the story of intellectual stillness begins in classrooms, where the minds of the empire's future were shaped not toward curiosity, but toward obedience. Education is the quiet engine of a civilization. It forms the minds that later build, govern, discover, and defend. When it moves forward, societies evolve. When it stands still, societies begin drifting into the past. In the Ottoman Empire, the education system had once been a source of strength, producing scholars, administrators, and judges whose work shaped the vast territories under imperial rule. But over time, the purpose of education shifted. It became less about exploring the world and more about preserving tradition, an elegant but limiting goal in an era when the rest of the world was transforming at unprecedented speed. Inside the empire's schools, young students began their days by memorizing classical works, the same texts their teachers had studied and their teachers before them. Recitation became the standard of excellence. Students were praised for accuracy, discipline, and reverence for established knowledge. They learned the words of long-dead scholars with great precision, yet often without the encouragement to question, interpret, or expand upon them. The past became a destination rather than a foundation. The act of remembering overshadowed the act of imagining. In many madrasas, lessons followed rigid curricula that rarely changed. A promising student could rise through the educational ranks by demonstrating loyalty to tradition, not by proposing new ideas. Innovation, even when respectful, was viewed with suspicion. Teachers feared that deviating from established interpretations might be seen as arrogance or disrespect. As a result, classrooms became places where the horizon of possibility narrowed with each passing year. Meanwhile, across Europe, the intellectual atmosphere had become almost electric. Universities encouraged experimentation. Students were urged to test theories, challenge authorities, and produce results through observation rather than memorization. Laboratories replaced recitation halls. Debate replaced obedience. Inquiry replaced repetition. The scientific method, still new but enormously influential, reshaped how young Europeans understood the world. Knowledge became something to pursue, not to guard. This contrast created an ever-widening gap. European students learned to question why things were the way they were. Ottoman students learned to remember how things had always been. One group grew into innovators, engineers, and reformers. The other grew into guardians of tradition, capable, disciplined, and intelligent, but unprepared to meet the accelerating challenges of the modern age. The empire's reliance on rote memory did not stem from a lack of talent. Ottoman students were often bright, dedicated, and capable of profound insight. The issue lay in the structure of education itself, which rewarded conformity rather than creativity. A student who asked too many questions might be scolded for wandering outside accepted knowledge. A student who offered an original interpretation risked seeming rebellious. Without a culture that nurtured inquiry, even gifted minds slowly learned to quiet their curiosity. This had consequences beyond intellectual stagnation. The empire struggled to adapt to technological change because its educational system did not produce enough engineers, mathematicians, and scientists trained in modern methods. When new inventions appeared abroad, steam engines, telegraphs, advanced artillery, the empire had to rely on foreign expertise to understand and implement them. Educational institutions could not easily produce the specialists needed to modernize administration, military organization, or industry. The foundation of progress had weakened long before the empire realized how necessary it was. The tragedy was subtle. Ottoman schools continued to function, Students continue to graduate. Books continue to be copied, read, and taught. The system appeared stable, even impressive in its devotion to classical learning. But stability without adaptability becomes stagnation. A civilization thrives only when its schools encourage minds to push beyond the boundaries of inherited knowledge. As the 19th century progressed, some reformers recognized the need for change. They called for new academies, modern curricula, and scientific training. But these reforms faced resistance from those who saw innovation as a threat to cultural identity. The struggle between tradition and modernity played out in classrooms just as fiercely as it did in politics and the military. By the time significant reform finally arrived, the world had already surged forward. Europe's industrial and intellectual revolutions reshaped global power, while the Ottoman education system still prepared students for a world that no longer existed. The empire had not failed to teach, it had failed to evolve. And this failure extended far beyond schools. It seeped into daily life, shaping how communities understood work, progress, and possibility. From this point, the stagnation grew not only intellectual, but societal, a quiet slowing of energy across the empire, visible in the rhythms of towns, markets, and public institutions. This leads naturally to the next section, where we explore how this broad social drift deepened, leaving the empire increasingly unable to meet the demands of a rapidly changing world. Across the Ottoman Empire, culture was not merely a collection of customs, it was a mirror of centuries of triumph. It reflected victories that stretched from Europe to Arabia, architectural achievements that touched the sky, and a legacy that had shaped trade, religion, and politics across continents. This deep reservoir of pride helped sustain the empire through difficult times. But pride, when left unchecked and unexamined, can harden into something heavier, an instinct to protect the past at the expense of the future. By the 19th century, the Ottoman world found itself caught between two powerful forces, its pride in what it had once been, and its fear of what change might bring. Cultural identity had become an anchor, steadying the empire in a shifting world, but also preventing it from moving toward the reforms it desperately needed. Tradition dictated the rhythms of daily life. Every institution, from schools to guilds to courts, operated on rules shaped centuries earlier. People found comfort in these routines, believing that continuity promised safety. But continuity alone could not navigate a world that was rapidly transforming beyond the empire's borders. Fear played an equal role. Leaders worried that any alteration to traditional structures might cause unrest. Communities feared that reforms, especially those inspired by Europe, would erode their way of life. Artisans worried that new technologies would render their skills obsolete. Religious authorities feared that modern ideas would disrupt spiritual harmony. Families feared that their sons, educated in new schools, might abandon the values they were raised with. It was not laziness or stubbornness that slowed change. It was the deep human fear that losing tradition meant losing meaning. This tension shaped every debate about reform. When new laws were proposed, critics argued that they threatened the empire's identity. When new schools were introduced, some communities worried they would undermine moral foundations. When new technologies appeared, guilds resisted adopting them, believing they would destabilize long-standing trades. Change felt dangerous, not because it was inherently harmful, but because it disrupted the familiar balance people had lived within for generations. Yet beneath the surface of this cultural resistance lay a quieter truth. Societies decline not when they lose strength, but when they lose adaptability. The Ottoman Empire still possessed resilience, resources, and talent. What it lacked was the willingness to reimagine itself. Pride kept it looking backward. Fear kept it from stepping forward. Together, these forces created a cultural stillness that slowed progress even as the world around it accelerated. Daily life reflected this stillness. Markets, once vibrant centers of trade innovation, relied on old methods even as global commerce modernized. Craft guilds clung to their ancient privileges, limiting competition and resisting technological improvements. Social customs, respected for centuries, became rigid frameworks rather than evolving traditions. People continued to live with dignity and purpose, yet the energy that once pushed the empire outward toward new discoveries, new territories, new ideas, began fading into gentle routine. The palace experienced this tension as well. Reformers urged bold changes, but conservatives warned that abandoning tradition would unravel society. The Sultan often found himself balancing between two visions, neither of which could fully take shape. Modernization seemed essential, yet every reform risked igniting conflict among those who saw change as betrayal. The empire became a house where each room carried a different rhythm, some reaching toward the future, others clinging to the past, creating a whole that struggled to move in any direction at all. This cultural paralysis was not visible in grand gestures but in countless small moments. A teacher scolding a curious student for questioning a lesson, a craftsman rejecting a new tool out of loyalty to his ancestors, a village debating whether to accept a telegraph line, a judge hesitating to adopt new legal practices despite recognizing their benefits. Each moment alone seemed small. Together, they formed a pattern that shaped the empire's fate. And so, as pride preserved memory and fear preserved stability, the empire's ability to adapt quietly faded. It did not collapse from cultural weakness, but from cultural immobility. Tradition became both comfort and constraint, a source of identity and a set of chains. This cultural stillness set the stage for the next chapter, where the empire's inability to adapt internally collided with pressures from the outside world. External conflicts soon arrived, not just as wars, but as mirrors reflecting what the empire could no longer change. The rivalry between the Ottoman Empire and Russia stretched across centuries, a long and heavy thread woven through the fabric of both nations' histories. It was not a story of sudden collapse or dramatic final battles, but of slow erosion conflicts that revealed weaknesses already growing within the Ottoman state. Each war played out like a mirror held up to the empire, reflecting its fading military edge, its internal disorganization, and its struggle to adapt to a changing world. The early encounters were fierce, but balanced. Ottoman cavalry cut across the steppes with speed and confidence. Janissaries still carried the pride of earlier victories. Russian armies, though determined, were far from the formidable force they would later become. But as decades passed, Russia invested relentlessly in modernizing its military. Its officers studied European tactics, its engineers built updated fortifications, and its rulers poured resources into strengthening the navy and artillery. With each reform, Russia grew more coordinated, more disciplined, and more technologically advanced. The Ottomans, meanwhile, fought with methods increasingly out of rhythm with the times. Their armies remained large, but size was no longer enough. European-style drills, centralized command structures, and modern weaponry shaped victory in the new era of warfare, and the empire struggled to adopt these changes. The Janissaries resisted reforms. Commanders disagreed over strategy. Communication between provinces and the capital remained slow and fragmented. When wars erupted, the Ottoman forces often marched into battle, carrying the legacy of an earlier age. The defeats came gradually, each one widening the cracks in the empire's foundations. A fortress lost here, a fleet destroyed there, a treaty signed under pressure. On maps, the borders shrank in small steps, not dramatic sweeps. Yet with every concession, the empire felt its confidence diminish. The wars revealed not just military weakness, but administrative confusion, financial strain, and the lingering consequences of palace politics. The losses were symptoms of deeper conditions, not causes of new ones. In the fields of the Balkans, Ottoman forces faced Russian troops, whose discipline and precision contrasted sharply with their own growing disarray. Battles that might once have ended in stalemate now tilted steadily toward Russia. Winter campaigns, long a Russian strength, became nightmares for Ottoman soldiers unprepared for the harsh conditions. When peace terms were negotiated, Russia consistently extracted strategic advantages, access to warm water ports, influence over Orthodox Christians in Ottoman lands, and growing leverage in the Black Sea. Each treaty felt like a tightening of a noose. On the empire's northern shores, the Black Sea changed from an Ottoman-controlled arena into a contested zone. Russian ships, built in modern docks and armed with updated guns, challenged Ottoman naval dominance. Naval engagements underscored how far behind the empire's shipyards had fallen. Even when Ottoman sailors fought bravely, their vessels simply could not match the firepower and maneuverability of their opponents. Inside the empire, these defeats stirred unease. Ordinary people felt the effects indirectly: higher taxes, disrupted trade routes, the loss of familiar territories. Soldiers returned home with stories of battles fought with outdated weapons against ever-advancing Russian forces. Officials sent reports to the capital describing logistical failures, late supplies, insufficient reinforcements. But the palace, entangled in its own internal struggles, often responded too slowly or with half measures that changed little. And yet, despite these repeated setbacks, the empire endured. It did not crumble in the face of Russian pressure alone. It survived wars that would have destroyed smaller states. But survival came at a price. The slow realization that the balance of power had shifted permanently. Russia had not only defeated Ottoman armies, it had exposed the empire's inability to keep pace with the transformations sweeping across Europe. The Ottoman state learned, painfully, that external defeats often reflect internal stagnation. The losses to Russia were not the beginning of decline. They were the visible expression of weaknesses that had been accumulating for generations. What Russia conquered was not Ottoman territory alone, but the illusion that the empire still held the military superiority of earlier centuries. As the empire weakened along its northern front, another set of pressures emerged much closer to home. Nationalist movements in the Balkans began to grow bolder, inspired by earlier revolts and emboldened by foreign support. And so we turn now to the next chapter, where internal uprisings would challenge the empire from within, revealing fractures even deeper than those exposed on the battlefield. The Balkans had always been a mosaic mountains dotted with small villages, valleys carrying echoes of different languages, and cities where cultures overlapped like colours on a weathered tapestry. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had managed to hold these diverse communities together under its vast umbrella. The region was restless at times, but it remained part of the imperial world. Yet by the 19th century, the threads binding this mosaic began to loosen. Pressure from within and influence from abroad set off a chain reaction the empire could neither predict nor contain. Nationalist movements in the Balkans did not erupt suddenly. They emerged slowly, nurtured in church basements, taverns, and remote mountain houses. Priests, poets, and school teachers became unlikely revolutionaries. They taught new generations that their ancestors had once been free, that their languages held ancient significance, and that their communities deserved futures shaped by their own hands. These were quiet, powerful ideas. They spread from village to village like embers carried on wind, small at first but capable of sparking wide rebellions. Greece offered one of the earliest signals. Intellectuals abroad wrote of ancient glories, stirring pride among people who had long lived under Ottoman administration. Foreign support flowed in, carried by sympathizers who saw Greek independence as both a noble cause and a strategic advantage. When revolt finally erupted, it shook not only the region but the very idea that the empire's hold over the Balkans was permanent. Although the Ottomans fought fiercely, the conflict exposed how much the world had changed and how many wished to see the empire diminish. Serbia followed, driven by local leaders who rallied communities weary of heavy taxes and foreign interference. Their uprisings were both political and emotional, blending the desire for autonomy with the lingering memory of older injustices. Each small victory gave rise to new demands. Each negotiated compromise left the empire with one fewer point of leverage. The momentum of independence had begun, and it was drawing strength from every corner of the region. Bulgaria, too, awakened. Schools, supported by nationalist groups, taught children to read and write in their own language, nurturing a sense of identity that no empire could easily suppress. When uprisings broke out, they were met with harsh Ottoman reprisals. News of the violence travelled quickly across Europe, igniting outrage and prompting foreign governments to intervene diplomatically and militarily. Once again, external powers amplified internal conflicts, widening cracks the empire struggled to mend. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, the tensions grew layered and complex. Communities divided by religion, language, and history found themselves caught between imperial control and the rising influence of neighbouring states. No single movement dominated. Instead, overlapping identities pulled the region in multiple directions. The empire attempted reforms, offered concessions, and sent administrators to restore order. But each step felt like trying to stitch torn fabric while the edges continued unraveling. Throughout these upheavals, the Ottomans faced a painful truth. Societal fractures spread faster than their ability to repair them. Every rebellion drained resources, every negotiation weakened authority, and every independence victory in one region inspired hope or defiance in another. The empire's long-standing diversity, once celebrated as a strength, now became a source of fragmentation. People no longer saw themselves as part of a vast imperial system, but as members of smaller, more intimate nations longing for self-determination. Ottoman officials understood this shift, but they faced impossible choices. Grant too much autonomy, and more provinces would seek independence. Grant too little, and uprisings would become inevitable. Even reforms meant to calm tensions often arrived too late, or were rejected by both sides, seen by nationalists as insufficient, and by conservatives as dangerous. Foreign powers deepened the turmoil. Russia supported Slavic peoples to expand its influence. Austria-Hungary eyed territorial opportunity. Britain and France intervened when it suited their strategic interests. Diplomats spoke of protecting local populations, but their involvement often tangled the region in more complexity. The Balkans became not only a site of local rebellion, but a stage upon which the great powers projected their ambitions. As these movements gained strength, the Ottoman Empire gradually lost its foothold in the region. Territories that had been part of the imperial world for centuries slipped away one after another. For those living through this period, the change felt both exhilarating and devastating. Some communities celebrated newfound freedom, others feared the uncertainty that followed. Families were uprooted, borders redrawn, and entire populations shifted in the wake of conflicts that sometimes felt inevitable. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Balkans had transformed into a volatile landscape of new nations, unresolved tensions, and competing interests. The Ottoman Empire, weakened and stretched thin, struggled to navigate these shifting realities. The unraveling of the Balkans did not destroy the empire outright, but it revealed how vulnerable it had become, how deeply the foundations had cracked. And so we move toward the next turning point, when the pressures of nationalism, foreign rivalry, and imperial strain converged into the global catastrophe of World War I, a conflict that would shape the final chapter of the Ottoman story. When the First World War erupted in 1914, much of the world was shaken by its suddenness. But for the Ottoman Empire, the war did not feel like an unexpected catastrophe. It felt like an echo, an enormous violent confirmation of weaknesses that had been building for generations. The empire entered the conflict not as a confident power defending its place in the world, but as a state already worn thin, already uncertain, already drifting toward an end that seemed inevitable long before the first shot was fired. The decision to join the Central Powers did not emerge from a position of strength. It emerged from desperation. Ottoman leaders watched European alliances form, knowing the empire could not stand alone. Years of territorial losses, economic strain, and military stagnation had left the state vulnerable. Diplomacy offered no comfort. Britain and France had little interest in supporting an empire they viewed as outdated. Russia, the empire's old rival, sought influence over its remaining territories. In this atmosphere of isolation, Germany appeared as the only willing partner, not out of mutual admiration, but mutual calculation. The alliance was signed in quiet rooms, with the hope that German strength might compensate for Ottoman weakness. But alliances built on desperation rarely bring stability. The empire entered the war with outdated equipment, divided leadership, and an exhausted treasury. Its railways were incomplete, its communication systems fragile, and its armies stretched across too many fronts. The war did not create these vulnerabilities, it exposed them, magnifying every flaw under the pressure of modern conflict. On the battlefield, Ottoman soldiers fought with courage, often in conditions that would break even the strongest armies. In the deserts of the Middle East, troops marched across harsh landscapes with limited supplies. In the Caucasus, winter storms claimed more lives than enemy fire. Along the Dardanelles, Ottoman defenders held their ground with remarkable determination, turning back one of the most ambitious Allied landings of the war. These victories were real and significant, but they came at a cost the empire could not sustain. Every success required resources the state struggled to provide. Every front demanded reinforcements that drained manpower from already fragile provinces. Food shortages spread through civilian populations. Inflation, already dangerous before the war, surged to new heights. Refugees poured into cities as battles displaced entire communities. Disease spread through military camps where medicine was scarce. The war did not simply strain the empire, it revealed how thin the margin for survival had become. Even within the government, unity proved elusive. Factions disagreed over strategy. Some leaders pushed for bold offensives. Others argued for defensive caution. The weight of earlier decades, bureaucratic distortions, court politics, and internal mistrust persisted even in a moment when unity was essential. Decisions were made unevenly, sometimes impulsively, sometimes too slowly. And while German officers offered advice, their priorities did not always align with Ottoman needs, leaving the empire pulled between its own interests and those of its allies. As the war dragged on, the empire's internal fractures deepened. Arab provinces, already influenced by nationalist ideas, moved further from Istanbul's control. European powers encouraged revolt, promising independence and support. Regions that had once been firmly tied to the empire now slipped away under the combined pressures of war, hunger, and political opportunity. By the time the Ottoman government realized how quickly loyalty was dissolving, the disintegration had already taken hold. When defeat finally came, it arrived without dramatic final battles on the empire's core territory. It came instead through exhaustion, economic collapse, and the steady loss of the empire's remaining provinces. The armistice marked the end of a state that had been dying slowly for decades. World War I delivered the final blow, but the wound had been opened long before. And here lies the quiet truth. The empire did not fall in 1918 because it lost the war. It fell because the war revealed it had already lost the internal structures, unity, and adaptability needed to survive the 20th century. The conflict merely pulled away the last veil. From this point forward, the question was no longer how to preserve the empire, but how to navigate its final years with dignity. And so we turn now to the last attempts at survival efforts made in desperation, in hope, and in the fading light of an empire that had already passed its turning point. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a crossroads where hope and despair intertwined. The old structures had weakened, the provinces had drifted, and the internal fractures left by centuries of slow decline had become impossible to ignore. Into this fragile landscape stepped the Young Turks, a movement driven not by tradition, but by urgency. They saw an empire slipping away and believed that reform, bold and immediate, was the only path to salvation. Their vision was ambitious. They aimed to modernize the army, strengthen the economy, centralize administration, and reshape society all at once. They believed that by pulling every lever simultaneously, education, law, military, industry, they could force the empire into the modern age. In their minds, delay would be fatal. If they acted decisively, perhaps the state could regain the strength it had lost to corruption, stagnation, and foreign influence. But behind their determination lay a quiet desperation. They were not building a future from a stable foundation. They were trying to reinforce a structure already cracking from stress. Each reform was intended to solve a problem, yet each also risked provoking resistance from groups that feared losing long-held privileges. Centralization alienated regions that valued autonomy. Military changes angered soldiers accustomed to older systems. Cultural reforms unsettled communities deeply attached to tradition. The Young Turks wanted unity, but their methods often deepened divisions. Inside government halls, conversations were filled with urgency. Officials drafted new laws late into the night. Committees debated how to transform the empire's administrative machinery. Newspapers praised progress, celebrating the promise of a stronger nation. On paper, the reforms were impressive. They introduced modern schools, modern legal codes, and modern expectations of citizenship. But the empire they were trying to rescue was already stretched thin financially, socially, and politically. The Young Turks believed central authority would bring stability. Instead, it revealed how much cohesion had already been lost. Provinces with strong local identities rejected the sudden pressure to conform. Minorities viewed the reforms as attempts to erase their differences rather than protect their rights. Arab leaders, Balkan communities, and Anatolian peasants each interpreted the changes through the lens of their own struggles. What appeared as modernization in the capital felt like intrusion elsewhere. Meanwhile, external pressures continued. European powers continued to intervene diplomatically, economically, and militarily. The empire's weakened borders and depleted resources left it vulnerable to manipulation. Every attempt to strengthen the center provoked reactions on the periphery. Reforms that might have succeeded in earlier centuries now appeared too late to rebuild unity. The Young Turks also faced the weight of expectation. They had risen to power, promising transformation. Failure meant not only disappointment, but disillusionment. In their haste, they sometimes turned reform into coercion. Ideas meant to uplift the empire were enforced rigidly, before society had time to absorb them. Innovation became associated with pressure, and pressure invited backlash. The more urgently they pushed, the more resistance they encountered. This is the tragedy of their movement. They were the right reformers, but at the wrong moment. Their vision was shaped by genuine belief in progress, yet the empire they inherited was too fragmented to accept sweeping change. They tried to rewrite centuries of decline in a single generation. But history does not move at the speed of legislation. It moves through the deeper currents of identity, trust, and cohesion. And these currents had long since shifted beyond their control. Even as they implemented impressive reforms, something essential had already been lost: the old sense that the empire could still pull itself together. The Young Turks worked tirelessly to craft a stronger state, but they could not restore the unity that had eroded over decades of political, cultural, and economic strain. They were fighting time itself, an enemy no law can defeat. And so, despite their efforts, the empire continued to drift toward collapse. Their reforms revealed not how much strength remained, but how much had already slipped away. From here, the story moves toward the final descent, where the empire's institutions unravel, its territories fall away, and its leaders confront the unavoidable truth that the Ottoman world they inherited could no longer be saved. The final years of the Ottoman Empire felt, to many who lived through them, like watching a great mountain crumble grain by grain. For centuries, its decline had unfolded slowly, so gradually that each generation believed the empire would endure just a little longer. But by the early 20th century, the long downward drift transformed into freefall. Territories that had once formed the spine of imperial identity slipped away in rapid succession. Finances that had endured wars, reforms, and shifting alliances finally reached a breaking point, and the sense of coherence that had bound millions beneath a single banner dissolved into uncertainty. The empire had been shrinking long before these final years, but the pace accelerated sharply after the Young Turk reforms failed to restore unity. The Balkans were already lost. North Africa had slipped away to European powers. The Arab provinces, stretched by wartime burdens and stirred by nationalist hopes, drifted further from Istanbul's control. What remained of the empire was not the vast, confident realm of earlier centuries, but a fractured landscape held together by little more than habit and fading memory. Financial collapse deepened the crisis. War debts mounted. Foreign loans, once accepted as temporary relief, became chains tightening around the treasury. Inflation surged. Railways fell into disrepair. The once impressive administrative system struggled to fund even basic services. Soldiers went unpaid. Families in the countryside faced shortages that darkened every season. Markets that had once bustled with trade now echoed with anxiety. The empire's economy, already weakened for decades, finally buckled under the weight of obligations it could no longer meet. Yet, to those who had not paid attention to the slow accumulation of these troubles, the collapse felt shockingly sudden. Cities that had seemed stable found themselves overwhelmed by refugees fleeing lost territories. Borders shifted faster than maps could be redrawn. Provincial officials wrote frantic letters to the capital, describing unrest they no longer had the power to contain. Even diplomats, accustomed to the empire's long decline, were startled by how quickly its remaining supports gave way. The destruction felt rapid, only because the foundations had been hollowed out long before. Inside Istanbul, the atmosphere grew heavy with resignation. Government offices buzzed with quiet urgency, as ministers attempted to manage crises arriving faster than they could respond. The palace debated new strategies, none of which seemed capable of reversing the tide. Newspapers printed cautious headlines, trying to maintain morale even as entire regions slipped beyond the empire's grasp. People spoke in lowered voices, asking the same unspoken question: how much longer could the state survive? There was no single moment that marked the beginning of the end. Instead, a series of events, territorial losses, economic collapse, political disillusionment, wove together into an irreversible pattern. In Anatolia, communities that had once felt secure experienced the war's devastation firsthand. Villages were emptied, cities swelled with displaced families. The familiar rhythms of daily life fell apart as uncertainty spread. What had been gradual weakness now felt like a tidal wave sweeping across the empire's heartland. International pressures intensified the freefall. European powers drew new borders, negotiated new spheres of influence, and made plans that scarcely acknowledged the empire's sovereignty. Treaties signed in distant capitals carved away lands that had been under Ottoman rule for centuries. Local leaders made their own deals, sensing that the empire's authority no longer carried the weight it once did. In some regions, loyalty fractured entirely. In others, people clung to the empire out of habit, not conviction. Emotionally, the collapse carried a quiet ache. Many citizens still felt pride in their identity, but pride alone could not sustain a disintegrating state. Elderly men spoke of battles from their youth, unable to reconcile their memories with the fragile reality around them. Mothers told stories of earlier generations to children who would grow up in an entirely different political world. The empire's fall was not just the loss of land or government, it was the unraveling of a cultural memory that had shaped millions of lives. As the final years unfolded, the empire seemed to exhale one long, weary breath. Not a dramatic cry, not a thunderous collapse, but a fading sigh of a world that had stretched itself across continents and centuries. Its final moments were marked not by defiance, but by exhaustion. The empire had endured wars, reforms, revolts, and rivalries, but it could not endure the accumulated weight of time, the quiet pressures that had weakened its core long before the freefall began. And so we move toward the last chapter of this story, where the empire's final structures dissolve, new nations rise in its place, and the world witnesses the end of an era that had shaped history for more than 600 years. When people imagine the end of an empire, they often picture a final battle, a thunderous clash, a dramatic collapse, a last stand on some windswept field. But the Ottoman Empire, after 6 centuries of shaping the world, did not die in the roar of cannons. It died in silence. Its final breath was not drawn on a battlefield, but in a government chamber, spoken in measured tones, recorded neatly on paper, and sealed with an official stamp. A moment so quiet that, for many, the meaning of it only settled in long after the announcement had already been made. After World War I, the empire existed largely in name. Its lands were occupied or divided, its finances were in ruins, its armies had been dismantled. Istanbul was filled with foreign uniforms and murmurs of treaties being drafted elsewhere. The government, once the center of a vast political world, oversaw little more than the city itself. Yet the old structure still stood bent, diminished, but not yet gone. For many, the hope lingered that the empire might somehow reclaim its identity, even if only in a reduced form. That hope ended on a calm November day in 1922, when the Grand National Assembly in Ankara voted to abolish the Sultanate. The announcement was simple, almost understated. There was no fanfare, no public ceremony to mark the moment. It was delivered as a formal declaration. The position of Sultan, the very heart of Ottoman political authority, no longer existed. With that single decision, the empire's 600-year-old institution vanished. One line of text ended a lineage that had survived crusades, sieges, revolutions, and centuries of shifting borders. In Istanbul, the last Sultan, Mehmed VI, received the news with quiet resignation. He understood what it meant. His authority, already symbolic, had now been erased entirely. On the morning of his departure, he left the palace that had housed generations of rulers. He stepped into an automobile escorted by foreign soldiers, British Marines who ensured a peaceful exit. His journey from the palace to the harbour was subdued. People watched from windows, unsure whether to mourn, to accept, or simply to observe. There were no riots, no cheers, no dramatic gestures. Just a silent city witnessing the end of an era older than most of its streets. When the Sultan boarded the ship that would take him into exile, the empire effectively disappeared from the world's political map. But it had been fading long before that moment. The abolition of the Sultanate did not destroy a functioning state. It formalized the disappearance of a structure that had already been hollowed out by decades of defeat, reform, recession, and internal fracture. The final act was only paperwork, the quiet closing of a story that had been unraveling for generations. For many who lived through that day, the emotional impact arrived slowly. Some felt relief, believing that a new republic offered the stability the old empire could no longer provide. Others felt grief, as though a familiar world had slipped from beneath their feet. Older citizens spoke of the sultans as symbols of continuity, keepers of memory. Younger people saw the moment as a threshold into modernity. And for countless families across the former empire's vast former territories, the announcement in Ankara confirmed what their lives had already shown. The Ottoman world was gone. The death of the empire was not marked by destruction, but by quiet acknowledgement. A system that had once governed millions across 3 continents ended with the stroke of a pen. Those who had ignored the long decline may have felt the moment as a sudden shock. Those who had watched the slow decay recognized it as the final step in a journey completed long ago. The empire did not collapse, it faded, gently and inevitably, into history. And now, with the empire gone and the modern world beginning to take shape, we move into the final chapter of this story, a reflection on what remains, what was lost, and what the long arc of Ottoman history can teach us about the rise and fall of civilizations. When we look back at the fall of the Ottoman Empire, it becomes tempting to see its decline as something unique, a story shaped by its own culture, geography, and centuries of complex history. But when we step back, when we place the Ottomans beside other great powers that rose and fell across time, a quieter truth emerges. The patterns that unraveled the Ottoman world were not new. They had unfolded before, and they would unfold again. Empires, despite their differences, tend to follow surprisingly similar paths, each convinced it will be the exception until the pattern catches up with them. Consider Rome, the eternal city that once commanded the known world. Its decline did not begin with barbarian invasions or dramatic civil wars. It began earlier, inside its own institutions. Political corruption spread slowly, often hidden behind rituals of stability. Soldiers demanded higher pay, drawing funds away from infrastructure and services. Provinces grew distant, ruled by governors who saw themselves as independent powers. By the time Rome faced external threats, the internal vitality that had built its greatness was already fading. Outsiders did not cause its downfall, they merely walked through doors Rome had left unguarded. A similar rhythm appeared in Qing China. For generations, the Qing rulers presided over immense wealth, vast territory, and rich cultural traditions. But over time, bureaucracy thickened, innovation slowed, and officials learned to hide unpleasant truths from the emperor. Conflicts grew between court factions. Rural communities suffered under uneven taxation. Foreign trade shifted in ways the state failed to adapt to. By the time Western powers arrived with new technologies and aggressive demands, the Qing system had already lost the flexibility needed to respond. Like the Ottomans, the Qing did not fall because they were weak. They fell because they had stopped listening to the world changing around them. Even the British Empire, whose decline unfolded within living memory, followed familiar patterns. It expanded rapidly across continents, built wealth on trade routes, and wielded influence through diplomacy and naval power. But beneath the surface, industrial shifts, mounting administrative costs, and rising nationalist movements created pressures that the empire struggled to manage. The British government attempted reforms, made strategic concessions, and tried to preserve unity through negotiation. Yet once the internal foundation began to strain colonial unrest, economic downturns, shifting global power, the imperial structure slowly loosened until it could no longer hold. The collapse was not sudden. It was the visible expression of decades of internal fatigue. This is the quiet rule history seems to obey. Empires rarely fall from a single blow. They erode from the inside long before they face their final external challenge. Decline begins in small decisions. Minor corruption tolerated for convenience, outdated systems left in place because reform seems too disruptive, leaders insulated from truth by layers of caution and comfort. These choices feel harmless in the moment. They accumulate silently, forming the foundations of future collapse. The Ottoman Empire reflected this pattern with painful clarity. Its bureaucracy grew cautious, its military resisted modernization, its education system clung to memory instead of innovation. Its leaders were surrounded by flattering voices rather than honest ones. Its provinces drifted toward identities older and deeper than the empire holding them together. Each issue seemed manageable on its own. Together, They created a storm that no late reform could reverse. And so, when we compare these stories, a sobering question arises. Are today's empires modern nations, global corporations, international institutions repeating the same silent mistakes? Many of the warning signs from past empires appear familiar in the modern world. Increasing centralization of power, growing distance between leaders and citizens, economies strained by short-term decisions. Complex problems deferred because they seem politically inconvenient. Societies caught between pride in their achievements and fear of necessary change. Technology evolving faster than institutions can adapt to it. These patterns do not predict collapse, but they echo the rhythms of decline seen across centuries. History does not give us perfect answers, but it offers a mirror. When we look into it, we see that the fall of an empire is rarely dramatic. It is a slow drift, powered by habits that once brought success but eventually prevent renewal. It is the gradual narrowing of imagination, the soft fading of curiosity, the moment when yesterday's solutions become today's obstacles. The Ottomans, the Romans, the Qing, the British, each believed their world would last because it had lasted for so long. Each trusted the strength of old systems. Each failed to notice when those systems stopped evolving. And as we reflect on these cycles, the story naturally turns inward to the lessons individuals can draw from the rise and fall of civilizations, and to how personal choices mirror the same patterns that shape the fate of empires. When we examine the final years of the Ottoman Empire, or any empire, for that matter, it becomes clear that collapse is almost never a single event. It is a tapestry of moments, choices, hesitations, and habits that accumulate slowly, quietly, often invisibly. The great turning points of history rarely announce themselves with clarity. They unfold in private rooms, in unnoticed conversations, in decisions that feel too small to matter. And yet, when we follow these threads backward, we discover that the fate of nations is shaped in the same way our lives are, moment by moment, through choices that seem harmless until they are not. For centuries, the Ottoman world assumed it would continue simply because it always had. The routines of governance felt stable. The rituals of court life created a sense of continuity. The familiar structures made it easy to believe that tomorrow would look like yesterday. But decline is not born from dramatic errors. It grows from comfort, from the belief that change can always wait one more day. That belief, so human and so understandable, is what ultimately shaped the empire's trajectory. History's quietest moments often hold the greatest weight. A scribe softens the truth in a report to avoid conflict. A commander delays reform because the old methods feel safer. A teacher discourages a curious student from asking questions that challenge tradition. A minister chooses a temporary fix instead of a long-term solution. Each gesture is small, almost invisible. Yet over time, these gestures accumulate, shaping the direction of institutions, cultures, and entire civilizations. The lesson is not that empires fall because people make foolish decisions. The lesson is that they fall because the small decisions are too easy to justify. It is simpler to delay reform than to push forward against resistance. Simpler to avoid discomfort than to face difficult truths. Simpler to preserve tradition than to accept that the world has changed. These choices do not destroy an empire immediately, but they prevent it from renewing itself when renewal is needed most. And this pattern extends far beyond history books. Nations today face quiet turning points of their own. Institutions, companies, and communities confront moments where the easy path diverges from the necessary one. Individuals make decisions every day how to act, how to speak, what to ignore that ripple outward in ways they may never see. The past suggests that the choices shaping the next century are being made right now, in rooms that seem unimportant by people who do not realize the weight of their influence. The real insight hidden inside the Ottoman story is this. The forces that bring down empires are the same forces that shape personal lives. Neglect, hesitation, fear of change, and quiet acceptance of the familiar, these patterns exist everywhere, not just in palaces and parliaments. Decline begins when curiosity grows quiet, when honesty becomes uncomfortable, when institutions lose the courage to evolve, and when people lose the willingness to question what they have always done. But the story also carries a gentler message. If decline grows silently, then renewal can grow silently too. A single honest conversation can redirect a relationship. A small reform can reshape an institution. A shift in perspective can change the course of a life. A decision made with clarity rather than fear can build foundations that last. History teaches us that the moments we overlook are often the ones that matter most. The empire's fall was not sealed by its final defeats, but by years of choices made with good intentions but limited vision. By recognizing these patterns, we do not just understand the past, we learn how to navigate the present. And so, as the story of the Ottoman Empire draws to its close, the question left behind is not only what happened long ago, but what echoes of that history are unfolding now. What habits are we repeating? What truths are we avoiding? What small decisions will shape the world long after we are gone? These reflections lead us into the final chapter of this journey, a quiet, emotional closure, where the rise and fall of an empire becomes more than a historical account. It becomes a meditation on time, memory, and the fragile beauty of all human creations. In the final light of the empire's long history, there was no great collapse, no thunderous finale, no shattering moment that marked the end. Instead, the Ottoman Empire slipped gently into memory, the way an evening tide withdraws from the shore. Slowly, quietly, almost tenderly. It receded from the world one step at a time, leaving behind echoes of its presence, mosques catching the last gold of sunset, marketplaces filled with stories older than the stones beneath them, and the soft murmur of the call to prayer drifting across rooftops that had once belonged to a vast and powerful realm. As the new century unfolded, the empire's territories were gone, its institutions dissolved, and its final ruler carried into exile. Yet the silence that followed did not feel like defeat. It felt like dusk settling over a long, intricate day. A civilization that had endured for 600 years did not vanish. It simply transformed, its identity shifting from a living empire into a memory carried by millions: Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, and countless others who had once lived beneath its wide umbrella. The streets of Istanbul, once the beating heart of an empire, continued their rhythms. Boats still crossed the Bosporus, fishermen still cast their lines at dawn, and minarets still cast long shadows over narrow alleys. But something had changed, something subtle, almost imperceptible. It was the feeling that history had turned a page. The empire was no longer a force shaping the world. It had become part of the world's deep reservoir of stories. This is how endings usually come. Not with spectacle, but with a shift in the wind. Empires, like people, rarely notice the exact moment when their strength becomes memory. They fade through choices made over lifetimes, through quiet compromises, through time's slow but steady pull. And when their final moment arrives, it feels less like a fall and more like a long exhale after centuries of holding breath. For those who lived in the twilight years of the Ottoman world, the end did not feel like destruction. It felt like transition. Elders told children of sultans who ruled lands stretching from the Balkans to the Arabian deserts. Shopkeepers remembered days when merchants from 3 continents gathered in the same market. Families recalled the old diversity of villages, where many languages mingled like threads in a woven cloth. These memories did not disappear. They softened, like waves smoothing the edges of stone. Even today, the empire lingers in small gestures and fragments of culture, in the curve of an archway, in the scent of spices drifting from a kitchen, in the melodies carried by musicians whose ancestors once played in courts and caravans, in the languages that still borrow words from one another. The empire exists not as a political power, but as an echo, gentle, enduring, impossible to fully erase. And there is a strange beauty in this. An empire does not need to survive to remain meaningful. Its legacy floats on, carried by stories, traditions, and memories that travel further than any army or decree. The Ottoman world, like Rome, like the dynasties of China, like the empires of Europe, lives on in the spaces between the present moment and the past. It survives in the human habit of remembering. As this story comes to its close, the empire stands not as a fallen power but as a reminder that all human creations, no matter how vast, are temporary. That time reshapes everything, that endings can be gentle, and that what remains after the fading is often more enduring than the empire itself. The art, the architecture, the music, the poetry, the philosophies, the shared histories, All of these continue long after borders dissolve. In the quiet of night, when the world feels still and history seems almost close enough to touch, one can imagine the echoes of that empire drifting across the centuries, like a final call to prayer carried on the breeze. Soft, fading, eternal in its own way. And so the story settles, like dusk over a distant horizon, a calm and gentle end where the empire fades, but its echoes remain, guiding us softly into reflection, into memory, and into the silence that follows the last line of history.